There is a stone statue of Bill Cipher sitting alone in the woods outside Gravity Falls, one hand reaching up toward nothing, frozen mid-laugh, and the show never quite resolves what it is waiting for. A decade later, fans still argue about what is supposed to come back and grab that hand. Gravity Falls ran for only 2 summers on screen, and it is still sitting on mysteries it never fully answered. Details people remember wrong, ciphers decoded years after the fact, and a creator who keeps quietly adding to the canon. Tonight on Pine Hat, we are going through every layer of it: the Mandela effects, the hidden frames, the secret meanings, the author, the axolotl, all of it. So get comfortable, dim the lights, we will be here a while, and if you have not subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these. Let us begin with that statue, because it is the kind of detail people argue about most. In the final moments of the series, after the credits of the 3rd part of Weirdmageddon, the camera drifts through the forest, past trees and undergrowth, and settles on a small gray shape, half buried in moss. It is Bill Cipher, in his stone form, one hand outstretched, palm open, waiting to be shaken. There is a phrase carved or implied beneath him, and a number of viewers will tell you with absolute confidence that the final shot has Bill speaking, or that you can see his eye glowing, or that his stone form clearly cracks in the last frame. None of those things are quite what happens. The shot is silent. The eye does not glow. The stone is intact. What actually happens is much quieter and much more unsettling. The camera simply lingers, the music fades, and the screen cuts to black on a Bill Cipher who is still, in theory, very capable of being summoned, if anyone foolish enough were to find him and complete the handshake. That image, of an ending that is not really an ending, is the shape the entire show takes. Most of what people remember about Gravity Falls is half right, half rearranged by years of fan theory, and the truth is almost always more careful than memory makes it. Consider the opening sequence, because almost nobody who watched the show as a child remembers it accurately. The intro is short, only about 30 seconds in its full version, and it is packed with material that the show treats as decoration, but which is actually load-bearing. There is a flash, very brief, of Bill Cipher's symbol forming behind static, and there is a tiny moment where you hear backwards speech layered into the theme tune. The backward speech, when reversed, has been confirmed by Alex Hirsch to be a real message. It is a short phrase, 3 words, that you can decode by ear if you slow it down and reverse it. And what it says, by most accounts, is a quiet pointer toward the cipher system the show is about to teach you to read. People misremember the intro in a few specific ways. Some swear the backwards message is longer than it is. Some are convinced that the intro flashes Bill's full body, when it actually only ever flashes a fragment of his shape. Some remember the opening title card spelling the town's name in a different font, or with a different color palette, and a few are absolutely sure that the intro changes substantially after a particular episode in the 2nd season, when in truth it changes only very slightly, with a single new flash inserted near the end, as a quiet acknowledgement that the audience now knows more than they did before. That is one of the loveliest tricks the show plays. The intro itself becomes a cipher you only solve in hindsight. The bigger Mandela effect, the one that grew up around Gravity Falls more than any other, has to do with Bill Cipher himself, and specifically when he first appears in the show. Ask a longtime fan, and you will get all sorts of answers. Many will tell you Bill appears in the very first episode, that there is a clear shot of him hidden in the woods or carved into a tree somewhere in the pilot. Many will tell you the first proper Bill appearance happens around the middle of the 1st season, when the boys are exploring the forest. A few will tell you, with total confidence, that the very first scene of the show contains him, that the camera passes him on the right-hand side of the screen as the car drives into town. What the show actually does is more patient than any of those memories. Bill, as a character, makes his first speaking appearance near the end of the 1st season, in the episode that takes place inside Stan's dreams. Before that, however, he is hidden in a dense scattering of small visual cues, carved into stone tablets in the forest, painted onto cave walls in flashback sequences, woven into stained glass in the background of a single shot, etched as a tiny silhouette into the back of a photograph. The collective memory of fans has fused all of those background details into a sense that Bill was always visible, when in truth he was always there but never visible, just below the surface, until the show decided to bring him into the room. A related misremembered fact, perhaps the largest of all the Gravity Falls Mandela effects, is the matter of Stan's name. Throughout most of the 1st season and the early part of the 2nd, Viewers were told that the eccentric old man running the Mystery Shack was Stanford Pines, called Grunkle Stan, the great uncle of Dipper and Mabel. That is what every introduction calls him. That is what the merchandise of the time printed, and that is what the audience took to be his real name. When the truth is revealed, in the second season, a great many viewers will tell you they remember the show always making it slightly ambiguous, always hinting that something was wrong with the name, always letting you sense that Stan was hiding something. In reality, the show is much less helpful than memory suggests. The first season treats Stan's identity as a straightforward fact. He is Stanford Pines, end of story. The misdirection is total. When the reveal arrives, when the audience learns that the man we knew as Stanford was actually his twin brother Stanley, and that the real Stanford had been trapped in another dimension for 30 years, viewers reconstructed their memory of the earlier episodes to make the twist feel inevitable. There are clues, certainly, scattered through earlier episodes: a tattoo glimpsed under a sleeve, an offhand line, a photograph cropped just so, but the show was much more confident about lying to you than people now remember. That is a Mandela effect, built into the bones of the storytelling itself. The show wanted you to misremember its first season, and you obliged. Dipper's name is another. Many viewers, asked what Dipper's real name is, will guess something like Daniel, or Damien, or Dipper itself. Some are convinced that the show told us his real name in the early episodes, and that it was something like Mason or Marcus. The truth is that the show, in its broadcast run, never says his real name out loud. It is technically not a canon piece of information in any episode you can stream. The reveal happens outside the show, in a piece of supplementary material that Alex Hirsch wrote later, where the real name is given as Mason. Dipper is a nickname, a reference to the constellation shape of the birthmark on his forehead, the Dipper, which he keeps covered by his hat for most of the series. People remember the show telling them this. The show does not tell them this. Hirsch tells them this, in a book published after the finale, and the audience backfilled the memory. Seuss's name has a similar story attached to it. Many viewers know him simply as Seuss, the lovable handyman at the Mystery Shack, and they think Seuss is short for something like Susan, or Suarez, or some kind of nickname based on his last name. The actual answer is one of the more beautiful little jokes the show ever planted, because Seuss is short for Jesus, pronounced the Spanish way as Jesus, and his full name is given in a credit sequence as Jesus Alzamirano Ramirez. The show plants this very quietly. You can blink and miss it. People remember Seuss as having no real backstory or as being simply a character who was always Seuss. But in fact, the show gives him a complete familial history, a grandmother who raised him, a father who abandoned him, and an emotional arc that resolves in the final season when he finally accepts that the Mystery Shack is his real family. That arc is a quiet one, and many people remember it as smaller than it is. Mabel's sweater inventory is one of the most affectionately cataloged elements of the show, and it is also the source of constant misremembering. Some fans will swear that Mabel wears a different sweater in every single episode. The truth is close to that, but not exactly that. She does wear a remarkable number of different sweaters across the series, and the show keeps a careful internal continuity, ensuring that the sweater she wears in a given scene generally matches the color palette or thematic content of that scene. There are days within the show's chronology where she wears the same sweater across multiple events. There are sweaters that appear once and never again, and there are sweaters that appear in the background, hung over a chair, or stuffed into a suitcase, that she never actually wears on screen. People also misremember specific sweater designs. The shooting star sweater, the one most people associate with her, the bright pink one with a star across the chest, is the symbol she carries on Bill's wheel, and the symbol she is most often drawn with in promotional art. Many viewers will tell you she wears this one in the pilot. She does not. She wears it later, and it becomes iconic only over time, until memory backdates it to the very first scene of the show. The Zodiac wheel itself is a piece of Gravity Falls lore that operates almost entirely on misremembered priority. The wheel is a symbol that appears in the journals, in carvings in the forest, in flashbacks to Ford's research, and ultimately as the device that almost defeats Bill in the final arc. It is a circle, with 10 symbols arranged around its perimeter, and each symbol corresponds to a character. The pine tree corresponds to Dipper, the shooting star to Mabel, the question mark to Seuss, the ice bag to Wendy, the stitched heart to Robbie, the six-fingered hand to Ford, the crescent to Stan, the llama to Pacifica, the pentagram to Gideon, and the glasses to McGucket. People remember the wheel as appearing constantly throughout the show. In truth, The full version, with all 10 symbols visible at once, only appears a small number of times in the actual episodes, and only takes on its true significance in the finale. The individual symbols, however, are scattered everywhere, hidden in shots, etched into props, painted onto walls, so that the audience absorbs them slowly without consciously noticing. By the time the wheel is revealed, your brain has been recognizing it without knowing it. The ciphers are the next layer where memory and reality drift apart. Every episode of Gravity Falls ends with a short cryptogram displayed during the closing credits, which uses a different cipher depending on what point in the series you are at. The early stretch of the first season uses a Caesar shift, a simple letter substitution where each letter is shifted a fixed number of places. Partway through the first season, the cipher method changes. There is a run of episodes that use the @bash cipher, where each letter is replaced with its mirror image in the alphabet, so A becomes Z, B becomes Y, and so on. There is a further run that uses the A1Z26 cipher, where each letter is simply replaced by its position in the alphabet. The whole of the second season uses the Vigenère cipher, which requires a keyword to unlock, and is the most difficult of the four. People will sometimes tell you that the show uses a single cipher throughout, or that the ciphers are random nonsense that fans imposed meaning on. Neither is true. The ciphers are real, they are intentional, and the keywords for the Vigenère sections are given inside the episodes themselves, often as a line of dialogue that becomes the key once you know to look for it. The messages decoded from these end credits are usually flavorful asides, occasionally jokes, occasionally hints toward later plot developments, and occasionally direct addresses to the audience from Bill Cipher himself. Whole communities of fans worked through the credits cipher by cipher in real time as the show aired, and the show, in turn, fed material back to them, sometimes embedding messages in ciphers that referenced fan activity from previous weeks. The cryptography goes deeper than the credits. There are ciphers hidden in the journals, ciphers hidden in the opening sequence, ciphers in promotional materials, ciphers in tie-in books, and at one point, an entire real-world treasure hunt was triggered by a single hidden message in a piece of bonus content. The treasure hunt was the Cipher Hunt, conducted in the summer of 2016, where Alex Hirsch hid a real physical statue of Bill Cipher in a real location and laid a trail of clues that fans followed across continents to find it. Many people remember the Cipher Hunt as a piece of marketing engineered by Disney. It was not. By Hirsch's own account, it was a personal project he funded and orchestrated himself, partly as a thank you to the fan community, partly as a final flourish, and partly because he had become genuinely obsessed with the puzzle culture his own show had nurtured. The statue that the Cipher Hunt led to is the very same statue that appears in the final shot of the series, the one half buried in moss in the woods, and Hirsch confirmed afterward that the statue was placed in an actual forest in Oregon, the state the show is set in, where it became the center of a small pilgrimage before being removed for preservation. People will tell you the statue was eventually destroyed. It was not. It was relocated, kept in storage for a while, then exhibited in various places, and at the time of writing it still exists, an actual physical Bill Cipher that you could in theory go and shake hands with, if you were brave enough. The author of the journals is another piece of lore people misremember constantly. For most of the first season, the journals are presented as the work of an unknown figure, an author who clearly studied the strangeness of Gravity Falls in obsessive detail before disappearing under mysterious circumstances. There are clues to his identity sprinkled throughout the first season and the early part of the second. He has 6 fingers on his right hand, a detail you can see in his handwritten notes and in the symbol on the cover of each journal. He is associated with the color combination of red and gold. He worked with Fiddleford McGucket. He built a portal. He vanished into it. People often misremember when the author's identity is actually revealed in the show. Some are sure it is revealed early. Some are sure it is teased for the entire run and revealed only in the finale. The truth lies between. The author's identity, as Stanford Pines, is revealed during the second season in the moment Ford steps physically through the portal back into the basement of the Mystery Shack, and is then confirmed and elaborated upon in the episode that immediately follows, which is a flashback episode covering the entire backstory of the Stan twins. That flashback episode is one of the most narratively dense in the show, and it rewrites your understanding of almost every previous Stan scene. People remember the flashback as longer than it is. It is a single episode, about 22 minutes, and it covers the twins' childhood, their teenage years, their falling out, Ford's college and research career, his work with Bill, the portal accident, Stan's 30-year quest to bring Ford back, and the present-day reconciliation. It is one of the most efficient pieces of storytelling in modern animation, and it is dense enough that viewers commonly remember it as taking up multiple episodes when it does not. The 30 years that Ford spent inside the portal, and the dimensions he visited during that time, are another area where memory and canon diverge. Many viewers come away with the impression that the show actually depicts a number of these alternate dimensions, that we see Ford in a desert world, in an underwater world, in a world of crystalline beings, and so on. The show actually shows very little of his travels directly. We get a brief montage, a few flash cuts, an offhand reference to a specific dimension where he spent a long time, and not much more. The bulk of Ford's interdimensional history is given to us in supplementary materials, in journal pages reproduced in the published version of the third journal, and in later books. One specific dimension comes up by name in the show itself, identified as Dimension 52, where Ford apparently encountered a being called the Axolotl, but the rest of his travels are largely left to the imagination. People remember the show as wider in its world building than it actually was, because the supplementary material has so thoroughly filled in the gaps. The Axolotl is perhaps the most discussed piece of hidden lore in the entire Gravity Falls universe, and it has only become more so as more material has come out since the show ended. It is mentioned only briefly in the show itself, in the final moments of the second season, when Bill, in the process of being erased, speaks a short incantation in a strange language. That incantation, when decoded, contains a reference to the Axolotl, a being Bill addresses by name, and a request, or perhaps a plea, for some form of return or reincarnation. People remember the moment as much longer and more explicit than it is. In the actual finale, Bill's last words are very few. The bulk of what the Axolotl actually is, what it has done, what it means, and what role it played in Bill's origin, has been filled in by Alex Hirsch in later materials, principally a published book that arrived years after the show ended, which lays out a much more elaborate cosmology in which the Axolotl is a kind of cosmic entity that exists outside time, and which seems to have a complicated, possibly familial, possibly antagonistic relationship with Bill. The show implies all of this without stating it, and the supplementary material commits to it. So when you hear fans talk about the Axolotl as a central figure in Gravity Falls, that reading is right, but it is right because of what has been added since the show, not because the show itself ever spelt it out. Bill Cipher's backstory sits in the same category. Within the show, we are told very little about where Bill comes from. We see fragments, glimpses of him in a flat two-dimensional world, hints that he came from a place called the second dimension, references to a flat home he destroyed before crossing over into the third dimension. We are told he is a creature of pure energy, that he has existed for trillions of years, that he is mad in a way that being trapped in two dimensions for too long can make a being mad. The show keeps almost all of this oblique. The detailed version, in which Bill is presented as a being who burned his own family, his own dimension, and possibly his own parents in his ascent to the third dimension, is something that lives in supplementary material and in interviews and in the published Book of Bill. People will tell you the show told them this. The show implies it, the show does not state it. The distinction matters because much of the affection viewers feel for Bill as a character comes from the fully elaborated version, and that fully elaborated version is a collaborative creation between Hirsch's show and Hirsch's later writing. The Henchmaniacs, Bill's crew of demonic helpers, are another area where memory and canon disagree on the details. Most viewers can name a few of them. 8-Ball, the big one with the 8-ball for a head. Pyronica, the pink fire creature. Keyhole, the one shaped like a padlock. Teeth, the disembodied jaw. The bull, hectagon, amorphous shape, Kryptos, patchy fire, and so on. The show actually only spends a handful of scenes on these characters, mostly in the Weirdmageddon arc, and most of their names and personalities have been filled in by supplementary material rather than the show itself. The internet often remembers them as having entire episodes devoted to them, when in truth they appear in crowd shots, in a few set pieces, in the background of the pyramid, and only briefly take a starring role in any sustained scene. The depth of their characterization is largely a fan and creator collaborative project, finished by Hirsch later, and read into the show by an audience hungry for more of them. The pyramid itself, The floating pyramid base of operations Bill builds during Weirdmageddon has its own set of misremembered details. People will tell you the pyramid is much larger inside than it appears outside, that it is the size of a small city, that it has gardens and dungeons and chambers full of trapped souls. Most of those impressions are extrapolated from a small number of shots. The show gives us a throne room, a series of corridors, a chamber where Mabel is imprisoned in a wish bubble, and a holding area for human captives. That is essentially all we see. The rest of the structure is described in dialogue or implied in distant shots. Whole regions of the pyramid have been imagined into existence by audience memory, helped along by concept art that has appeared in art books and on creator commentaries, but you cannot point to most of those imagined places in any actual episode. Mabel's prison bubble, by contrast, is one of the most precisely detailed sequences in the entire show, and people often misremember it as larger than it is, too. The bubble is a self-contained pocket dimension built specifically to trap Mabel by offering her a perfect summer that never ends, in which she remains a child and her brother stays with her, and nothing has to change. The episode that takes place inside this bubble, which is part of the Weirdmageddon arc, is short, about 22 minutes, and yet viewers remember it as the emotional heart of the series. Inside the bubble we get Dippy Fresh, a fake, sugar-bright version of Dipper, designed by the bubble's logic to replace the real Dipper if Mabel chooses to stay. Many viewers misremember Dippy Fresh as either much more prominent or much less prominent than he is. He is on screen for only a few minutes, but he is the precise embodiment of what Mabel must reject in order to grow up. The interpretive heart of the show, what the show implies without saying outright, is that growing up is exactly that act of rejecting Dippy Fresh, of refusing the easy substitute for the harder, more loving real thing. And Mabel, in the end, refuses. People remember the bubble episode as the moment Gravity Falls became sad. It was always sad, but that is the moment the sadness becomes inescapable. McGucket is one of the characters whose backstory has been most thoroughly rebuilt by hindsight. In the early episodes of the show, Old Man McGucket is presented as a comic relief character, a wild-eyed local hillbilly with a high-pitched voice, a habit of attacking buildings with improvised weaponry, and a tendency to wander into scenes carrying a banjo and a bottle. He appears at the edge of episodes, never given much depth, easily dismissed as background color. The show is patient about him in a way that nobody expects on a first watch. By the second season, it has become impossible to ignore that McGucket is actually Fiddleford McGucket, a brilliant engineer with a doctorate, who worked alongside Ford on the Portal project as his closest collaborator, and who broke down mentally and emotionally as a direct result of what he saw on the other side of that portal. The reveal happens through a series of episodes, including one in which the children investigate a secret society in the town called the Society of the Blind Eye, and discover that this society has been erasing the memories of any townsperson who learns too much about the supernatural. McGucket is revealed to be the founder of this society. He built the memory-erasing device himself, and he turned it on himself first, repeatedly, to forget what he had seen. The hillbilly persona is what is left when a brilliant mind erases itself enough times. People often remember this reveal as much later in the series than it is. They remember it as a finale moment. It is not. It is mid-first season for the introduction of the Wild Man and mid-second season for the unmasking, and the show then has to live with it for a long time, building toward McGucket's eventual partial recovery, which happens during the Weirdmageddon arc when he, in a striking moment, removes the memory device's effects from himself and rejoins the fight as the lucid scientist he used to be. The Society of the Blind Eye itself is a piece of lore that fans have built up around. Some viewers remember it as a sprawling cult with hundreds of members and elaborate rituals. The show actually presents it as a small group, a handful of hooded figures meeting in a hidden underground chamber beneath a museum, with a single device, the memory gun, that is their central tool. Their stated purpose is to keep the town safe by removing knowledge of the strange things that happen in it. Their actual effect, the show implies, is to leave the townspeople defenseless against those same strange things, because nobody can prepare for what they cannot remember. The show takes a careful position on this, neither fully condemning the society nor endorsing it, which is part of what gives that arc its lingering weight. By the end of that storyline, the society is dismantled, its members have their own memories restored, and the device is broken. The device, however, returns in the finale, in a different form and with very different implications, when Stan uses it on himself to defeat Bill Cipher. That moment, That act of Stan deliberately erasing his own mind to save his family is one of the show's most quietly devastating beats. Viewers will sometimes misremember it as Stan being forced to do this against his will, or as something Ford does to Stan. It is not. Stan volunteers. He sits in the chair and lets his brother pull the trigger, and the show makes it absolutely clear that Stan understands what he is giving up. The recovery, when it comes from Mabel showing him a scrapbook of memories from the summer, and the show implies that Stan's love for the children is what brings him back, not the technology. The portal in the basement of the Mystery Shack is another piece of architecture people misremember the geometry of. Many viewers are convinced the portal is described as a trans-dimensional gateway capable of arbitrary connections, that Ford built it as a tool for general exploration. The show's actual presentation is more specific. The portal was built by Ford to investigate the connection between Gravity Falls and other dimensions, but it was a connection that Bill Cipher had been quietly nudging into existence the entire time. Bill, the show implies and supplementary material confirms, manipulated Ford into building the portal in the first place, presenting himself as a muse and a friendly otherworldly being, and gradually steering Ford toward a design that would, if completed, allow Bill to enter the third dimension permanently. Ford realized this too late. He attempted to dismantle the portal, the device malfunctioned, Ford was sucked into it, and the portal remained dormant for 30 years until Stan, who had been trying to reactivate it that whole time in order to bring his brother back, finally succeeded in the final episode of the first half of the second season. The single image of Stan, alone in the basement, finally pulling the lever and seeing the portal open, is one of the most discussed scenes in the show. Some viewers remember it as a triumphant moment. It is not. It is melancholic. Stan has spent his entire adult life on this. He has lied to his family for decades. He has sacrificed everything he had to bring back the brother who once disowned him, and the show plays the moment without music for a long beat, just the sound of the portal opening and Stan's exhausted breathing. A Tale of Two Stans, the flashback episode that follows the portal opening, is one of the few episodes that fans consistently agree on the importance of. It covers the entire backstory of the twins. Stanley, the rougher of the two, was always loyal to his brother. Stanford, the brighter of the two, won a scholarship to a prestigious school. There was an accident, attributed to Stanley, in which Stanford's school project was damaged, and his future trajectory was disrupted. Their father blamed Stanley and disowned him. Stanley spent the next decade or so as a drifter, a small-time con man, sleeping in his car, accumulating identities, learning the kind of survival skills he would later use to run the Mystery Shack. Stanford, meanwhile, eventually settled in Gravity Falls, conducted his research, met McGucket, met Bill, built the portal, and disappeared. Stanley returned to find the cabin abandoned, the journal that Stanford had been writing left as a clue, and a 30-year project began, in which Stanley would adopt his brother's identity, run the Mystery Shack as a cover, and use the proceeds to fund the slow reconstruction of the portal. People often misremember this episode as the moment where Stanley becomes likable, or the moment where his crimes are excused. It does neither. It explains him without absolving him. The show is careful to acknowledge that Stanley made a lot of bad choices, that some of those choices were responses to bad circumstances, and some were not, and that the brothers' relationship is genuinely fractured and will not be fully repaired even by the end of the series. The interpretation the show implies, the reading it offers without forcing, is that love between siblings can be both real and broken at the same time, and that 30 years of effort does not necessarily mean 30 years of forgiveness, but it does mean something. The Northwest family are the closest thing Gravity Falls has to old money aristocracy, and the show treats their hidden history with a particular kind of contempt. People sometimes remember the Northwests as straightforwardly evil, a generic rich antagonist family with no particular nuance. The actual presentation, especially in the episode that takes place inside their haunted mansion, is more careful. The Northwests claim to be the founders of Gravity Falls. They throw an annual ball celebrating this fact, and displayed prominently in their mansion is a portrait of their ancestor as a noble pioneer who chopped down the first tree and built the town with his own hands. The actual story, revealed during that haunted mansion episode, is that the ancestor was a fraud, that the real founding of the town was carried out by laborers the Northwest had hired and then refused to pay, and that the family had promised the laborers a celebratory event in exchange for their work, an event which they then canceled, leading to a curse being placed on the family by the lumberjack who led the laborers. The ghost of that lumberjack haunts the mansion every century and a half, and the curse can only be broken if the Northwests publicly admit the truth about the town's founding and open their gates to the common people. The episode ends with Pacifica Northwest, the daughter of the family, breaking the curse against her parents' wishes. People remember this episode as the moment Pacifica turns from villain to ally. That is partly right. The show is more honest than that. Pacifica continues to be flawed afterward, continues to have unresolved tensions with the Pines twins, and her arc never fully resolves into uncomplicated friendship. It resolves into something more like mutual respect, which is a much rarer thing to show on a children's cartoon. The town's actual founding is a piece of hidden lore that the show treats with great affection and very little reverence. The official founder of Gravity Falls in the show's universe is not the Northwests at all. It is a man named Quentin Tremblay, who is also, according to the show, the secret 8th-and-a-half president of the United States, a fact that has been quietly removed from history. Tremblay appears in a few episodes, having been preserved in a block of peanut brittle for over a century, and the show treats his absurd existence as canon, while never quite committing to him as a serious historical figure. The conceit is that he was elected president, then erased from history by a conspiracy of unscrupulous successors, and that his presidency includes such achievements as appointing several babies to the cabinet and signing legislation on behalf of a horse. The show uses Tremblay as comic relief, while also using him to subtly mock the kind of small-town historical revisionism that the Northwest family represents. People remember Tremblay as a more important character than he is. He has perhaps 15 minutes of total screen time across the series, but those 15 minutes are so memorable that the audience tends to expand them. Gideon Gleeful is another character whose role in the show people consistently overestimate. Gideon is introduced in the first season as a child psychic, a southern-accented preacher in a powder blue suit who claims to have actual paranormal powers and who runs his own tent revival-style stage show in the town. He is presented as a rival to Stan, an antagonist toward the Pines twins, and a person who is, in fact, in possession of one of the 3 journals and is attempting to use it to gain control of the Mystery Shack. He has a small army of devoted followers, a manipulative public persona, and a private personality that is petulant, childish, and dangerous. Gideon's arc reaches a kind of climax at the end of the first season, when he is publicly exposed and arrested, but the show keeps him in play across the second season as well, eventually reformed enough by the end to become a marginal ally during the Weirdmageddon arc. People often remember Gideon as a more constant villain than he actually is. He is locked up for a large portion of the second season, and his appearances during that stretch are limited to brief flashbacks and a few prison set scenes. The show was, by its creator's account, originally intended to make Gideon the main antagonist of the entire series, before deciding to pivot to Bill Cipher as the larger threat, which is partly why Gideon's role feels truncated in the way that it does. The interpretation, what the show implies in keeping him around even after his arc has technically completed, is that even the most insufferable of small-town tyrants are still children, and children can be rehabilitated, if imperfectly, if their environment changes. The shapeshifter is a creature you only meet once, in an episode set inside an abandoned underground research bunker, and yet that single appearance is one of the most discussed segments in the show. The shapeshifter is a being capable of taking on the form of any other creature, and it has been trapped in a cryogenic chamber beneath the forest for decades, kept there as part of Ford's research. When the twins accidentally release it, the show stages a long sequence in which the shapeshifter, taking on the form of various characters and creatures, hunts them through the bunker's corridors. The final image of the episode, the part everyone remembers, is the shapeshifter, frozen in cryogenic stasis again, taking on a specific form as its last act, a form that the show implies is Dipper's adult self or some other future image of him, designed to disturb him for the rest of his life. People misremember the specific form. Some say it is Dipper as an old man. Some say it is Dipper in a deformed shape. Some say it is something inhuman entirely. The actual form is left deliberately ambiguous in the show, and supplementary material confirms that the form is meant to be Dipper's worst nightmare made flesh, which the audience is permitted to fill in for themselves. That deliberate ambiguity is one of the show's most effective tricks. The thing the shapeshifter becomes is whatever you, sitting in your chair years later, find most uncomfortable. The bunker itself is worth lingering on. It is one of the few pieces of major Ford-related infrastructure we ever actually visit, and it is presented as a relic of Ford's research that he abandoned shortly before the portal accident. Inside the bunker, in addition to the shapeshifter's chamber, there is a long sequence of hidden rooms, a series of traps designed to weed out unworthy visitors, and a panic room intended to keep Ford safe from Bill's influence. People sometimes remember the bunker as being explored over multiple episodes. It is not. It is a single episode appearance, and almost everything we know about it comes from that one visit. The fact that the bunker felt so much larger in memory is, again, partly the effect of the show's dense visual storytelling. There is so much detail packed into each frame that the brain remembers having seen more than it did. The Wax Museum episode, which is one of the very first proper mysteries the show stages, is another that fans misremember. People remember it as a long, drawn-out, multi-episode arc. It is actually a single episode, and it is a self-contained murder mystery, in which a collection of wax figures in the Mystery Shack come to life at night and stage what is essentially a small-scale Gothic plot. The episode is structured as a parody of classic locked room mysteries, and it is also the first time the show signals that it is willing to operate at a level of literacy higher than most children's animation. The reveal that one of the older wax figures has been quietly murdering the others in revenge for being banished is a joke that operates at multiple levels simultaneously, and the show plays it perfectly straight. People remember the Wax Museum as appearing throughout the show, when in fact it burns to the ground at the end of that single episode and is referenced only in passing afterward. The figures themselves, however, leave a long shadow in the form of running gags and visual jokes, which is part of why memory expands the museum's actual screen time. The gnomes are a piece of show lore that people get strangely specific things wrong about. Everyone remembers the gnomes from the first episode, where they reveal themselves to Mabel as a horde of small bearded creatures attempting to abduct her as a bride for their Gestalt monarch. People remember the gnomes as continuously threatening throughout the series. In truth, after their first appearance, the gnomes mostly recede into background gags. They are visible in crowd shots, they cameo in jokes, they show up briefly in the final battle, but their main antagonistic role is confined to that pilot episode. Their leader Jeff, the perky bearded gnome who speaks for the collective, becomes a recurring face but never a recurring threat. The show seems to take a small affectionate pride in keeping the gnomes around as decoration, a reminder of how the strangeness of the town began, without elevating them to actual menace. People remember Jeff as villainous. He is not, after the pilot. He is mildly pathetic, which is funnier. The multi-bear is a creature from Dipper's manliness episode, a beast living in a cave in the mountains that the local conventionally masculine men of the town have determined must be killed in order for any boy to truly become a man. Dipper, having been mocked for his lack of stereotypical masculinity, goes on this quest, only to discover that the multi-bear is a perfectly pleasant being with refined musical taste, who agrees to be killed because he is tired of being hunted, and whom Dipper instead refuses to kill, choosing his own definition of manhood over the town's. People remember the multi-bear as appearing in multiple episodes. It does not. It appears in one. It is mentioned and glimpsed elsewhere. The episode itself is one of the show's quietest pieces of writing, and it operates almost as a parable about masculinity that the show is unafraid to commit to, even while wrapped in jokes about flexing and grunting. The interpretation, the reading the show offers, is that the manliest thing Dipper does in that episode is refuse to kill someone he likes. The Hand Witch is a creature from a single episode involving Stan's date with a woman who turns out to have a giant disembodied hand floating beside her at all times. People misremember this episode as being more elaborately developed than it is. The Hand Witch is, in the show, a brief antagonist with a one-note premise. The episode does, however, contain a number of small jokes about Stan's loneliness, his romantic history, and the way he uses humor to cover loss. The audience often retains those subtler beats and misremembers them as appearing in other episodes, because Stan's emotional life is sketched so lightly throughout the series that any direct treatment of it tends to make a disproportionate impression. The unicorns are a creature the show treats with a deliberate satirical edge. Mabel goes on a quest to obtain unicorn hair, which is required as an ingredient in a magical defense around the Mystery Shack, and discovers that the unicorns are not pure mystical creatures at all, but rather smug, judgmental beings who deny her access to their hair on the grounds that she is not pure of heart enough. The episode ends with Mabel and her friends physically attacking a unicorn to take the hair by force, and the show plays this for comedy that has aged into a kind of feminist satire of the entire trope. People sometimes remember the unicorn episode as a more straightforward fantasy adventure. It is not. It is the show explicitly mocking the entire idea of purity as a basis for moral worth. The show is doing this in a children's cartoon, and it gets away with it because the unicorns are so memorably condescending that no one watching is rooting for them. Time travel in Gravity Falls is handled by a single recurring character named Blendin Blandin, a man from the future, dressed in a color-shifting jumpsuit, who works as a kind of low-ranking maintenance employee in a future time travel agency, and who the twins keep accidentally getting into trouble across the run of the show. People often misremember how time travel works in this universe, recalling it as much more elaborate than the show actually presents. The show's time travel rules are essentially that Blendin has a device, the device gets stolen, the device gets used, the device gets recovered, and someone is held accountable. The twins steal the device the first time they meet Blendin, use it irresponsibly for an afternoon of pranks and minor crimes, are caught, and Blendin is punished for losing it. The next time he appears, he comes back for revenge, and the result is a competition called Globnar, which is essentially a gladiatorial event held in a future arena where contestants fight for a wish that can rewrite history. The twins win Globnar against Blendin, and rather than use their wish to rewrite anything serious, they use it to grant Blendin a happy life, which is a quietly generous moment that the show plays without underlining. People remember Blendin as appearing in more episodes than he does. He has, across the entire series, only 3 substantial appearances, plus a cameo in the finale, but his visual design and his bumbling tragic quality make him memorable enough that the brain expands his presence. The sock opera arc is one of the most discussed sequences in the show, and it is also the moment when Bill Cipher truly steps into the foreground of the narrative. People remember the sock opera as a standalone episode about Mabel putting on a puppet show. That is the surface. The actual content is much darker. While Mabel is preoccupied with her puppet show, Dipper, in his attempts to crack the encryption on a laptop that contains information about the author of the journals, makes a deal with Bill Cipher to gain access to his subconscious in exchange for a favor. The favor, which Bill takes immediately, is the use of Dipper's body. Bill possesses Dipper. Bill uses Dipper's body to destroy the laptop. Bill, while inhabiting Dipper, abuses the body in a deeply unsettling way, jabbing forks into its skin, slamming it into walls, laughing about pain receptors, and the show, even in a children's animation, does not flinch from showing this. The episode resolves when Mabel, choosing her brother over her puppet show, fights Bill in Dipper's body, and Bill is forced out. The interpretation the show offers is that Mabel's choice, the choice to give up her own artistic project in order to save her brother, is the defining act of the episode, and the puppet show is in some sense a metaphor for childhood itself, a thing you have to be willing to put down. People often misremember Bill's possession as longer than it is. Bill inhabits Dipper for only a small portion of the episode, but those minutes are so striking they extend in memory. The laptop Bill is so desperate to keep encrypted, in the sock opera episode, belonged to McGucket, and contained, the show implies, a record of the portal accident, including footage of Bill's role in it. The laptop is destroyed at the end of the episode, and most of what it contained is therefore lost, although fragments of its contents resurface later in the series and in supplementary materials. People sometimes remember the laptop as being recovered or repaired. It is not. It stays broken. That detail matters, because it represents a Bill victory that the show acknowledges but does not dwell on. Bill wins more battles than people remember. The memory gun, the device the Society of the Blind Eye used and which Stan eventually uses on himself, has a small canon of misremembered details around it. People often remember the device as a kind of futuristic ray gun. It is actually presented in the show as a relatively domestic-looking item, the size and shape of a hand vacuum, with a dial on the top that you set to the memory you wish to erase. The device works by typing or speaking the memory you want gone, then firing at the target. It does not erase entire identities by default. It removes specific memories. Stan's use of the device in the finale is dramatic, precisely because it is set to erase his entire mind, every memory he has, which is the only way to remove Bill, who has taken refuge inside Stan's head at that point in the story. People sometimes remember the device as being used on multiple characters in the finale. It is used on Stan alone. McGucket has previously cured himself of the device's effects, And that process is not the same as being shot with it again. The interpretation, the layer the show is asking you to read into the moment, is that Stan, who has been forgotten his entire life by the brother he loved and the father who disowned him, chooses in the final crisis to forget everyone else in order to save them. That symmetry is what makes the scene as devastating as it is. Bill's possession of Stan in the finale is one of the moments fans get the geography of wrong most often. The setup is this. Bill has invaded the third dimension, conducted Weirdmageddon for an unspecified but lengthy period of time, captured almost everyone, and turned the town into a chaotic hellscape. The Pines family has assembled what allies they can, fought their way through the pyramid, and is attempting to defeat Bill. Bill, however, has a barrier preventing him from leaving Gravity Falls, an invisible wall that contains his power within the town's limits. To escape this wall, Bill needs to enter the mind of someone with knowledge of the town's geography, then exit through that mind's awareness. He targets Ford, who refuses to cooperate even under torture. Then he targets Stan. Stan, posing as Ford, allows himself to be possessed, and Ford, knowing what Stan is up to, fires the memory gun, set to erase all of Stan's memories, while Bill is trapped inside Stan's mind. The result is that Bill is erased along with Stan's memories. People remember this scene as more graphic than it is, often recalling it as showing Bill physically dying or being torn apart. The show is more restrained. Bill realizes what is happening, screams, and is wiped out of existence. And the final image of him within Stan's mind is one of him as a stone shape, fixed in place, an image that prefigures the stone statue in the post-credits scene. The show's economy in staging this moment is part of what makes it land. There is no extended battle. There is a trick, then there is a sacrifice, then there is silence. The aftermath, the part of the finale where Stan slowly remembers his life through Mabel's scrapbook, is the moment many viewers cite as where they cried. The mechanism is simple. Stan does not remember who he is or who anyone around him is. He recognizes nobody. He responds to nothing. Mabel sits next to him with the scrapbook she has been making all summer and turns the pages slowly, narrating each photograph, telling him about the things they did together, the people they met, the family he chose. After a long stretch of nothing, Stan looks at one particular photograph, then looks at Mabel, then looks at Dipper, and slowly says her name. The show plays this without music for almost the entire scene, letting the silence carry the weight. And the moment Stan recognizes his great-niece and great-nephew is staged as a small miracle. People sometimes misremember this scene as being immediately resolved. It is not. The implication, both in the show and in supplementary material, is that Stan's recovery takes time, that there are pieces of his memory that may never come back, and that the version of Stan who returns is not exactly the same as the one who left. That ambiguity is the show's gift to the viewer, the refusal to wrap up trauma neatly even when the plot is technically over. The Weirdmageddon arc, taken as a whole, runs across 3 episodes at the end of the second season and is the show's apocalypse, its end-of-the-world story. People often remember Weirdmageddon as longer than it is, sometimes recalling it as a half-season. It is 3 episodes, although those episodes are dense and contain enough material for a much longer arc. The premise is that Bill, having been summoned into the third dimension through a portal at the end of the previous episode, immediately begins to remake reality in his image. The sky changes color, the laws of physics warp, people are turned into stone, buildings melt and rearrange. Strange new creatures pour into the town. The Pines family, scattered at the start of the arc, must regroup, assemble a coalition of survivors, and find a way to fight back. The arc includes the bubble episode with Mabel, the assault on the pyramid, the body swap moment between Stan and Ford, the memory gun sacrifice, and the post-credits stone statue. People remember Weirdmageddon as more apocalyptic in scope than the show depicts, partly because the show's animation is so vivid that the small chunk of town we see during the arc feels enormous, and partly because the show implies that Bill's influence is spreading globally even as we only see the town. The actual extent of Weirdmageddon outside Gravity Falls is left ambiguous in the show itself, although supplementary material confirms that Bill's reach was beginning to extend beyond the town's invisible barrier at the moment he was defeated. Dippy Fresh, the false dipper inside Mabel's prison bubble, is a character people both overrate and underrate, depending on how they remember the bubble episode. He is a hyper-masculine, sugar-high, surfboard-riding parody of an idealized brother, designed by the bubble's internal logic to give Mabel a version of Dipper who will never get tired of her, never want to grow up, never want to leave. The fact that he is fake is obvious from the moment he appears. The fact that he is appealing to Mabel anyway is the point. Mabel chooses to reject Dippy fresh and accept the real Dipper, with all his flaws, including his stated desire to stay in Gravity Falls and apprentice to Ford rather than return home with her at the end of the summer. That choice, that refusal of the substitute, is the structural heart of the episode and of the show. People sometimes remember Dippy Fresh as a more frequent figure in the bubble than he is. He appears for only a few minutes. His impact comes from what he represents, not from his screen time. Dipper's stated desire to stay in Gravity Falls and apprentice to Ford is one of the most discussed plot threads of the second season, and it is also one that many viewers misremember the resolution of. In the Bubble episode, Dipper has accepted Ford's offer to become his research assistant, which would mean staying in Gravity Falls indefinitely rather than returning home with Mabel at the end of summer. Mabel, in the same episode, learns this and is devastated. The Bubble is in part a manifestation of her grief over the impending loss. By the end of the finale, the resolution arrives. Dipper, having seen the cost of obsession in Ford's life, chooses to go home with Mabel. Ford, recognizing that the twins are inseparable and that the summer has ended, lets him go. People sometimes misremember this as Dipper being forced to leave, or as Dipper choosing Ford and then being overruled. He chooses Mabel. The interpretation the show offers is that the deepest thing you can learn from someone you admire is when not to be like them, and Dipper has learned that lesson from Ford by watching Ford lose his brother for 30 years. The Stan War is a boat, a small fishing vessel that the Stan twins first built together as children, salvaged from a wreck on a beach, painted with their joint name in the hopes that one day they would sail it together as adventurers. The boat is, in the show, both a memory and a goal. Stan keeps the dream of the boat alive throughout the series, although the original Stan War is long destroyed. The Stan War II, the boat they actually use in the finale, is built by Stan during the second season and is the vehicle on which the brothers depart Gravity Falls at the end of the show, after the children have gone home, to sail the world together. The show ends on this image of the two of them, finally reconciled, finally together, embarking on the adventures they planned as children, half a century late. People sometimes remember this image as the very final shot of the show. It is not. The final shot is the stone statue of Bill in the forest. The departure of the Stan War is the penultimate beat, and the statue is the coda that complicates it. That structure, hope followed by warning, is the show's signature. Wendy Corduroy is a character whose backstory the show alludes to more than it ever directly depicts. She is Stan's teenage employee at the Mystery Shack, the redhead with a hat and a flannel shirt and a perpetually casual attitude, and she is the object of Dipper's first significant crush. Her family, the Corduroys, are sketched as a clan of tough lumberjack types. Her father is a large, intimidating figure with a beard. She has multiple brothers, all of whom appear in a single episode in which Dipper attempts to prove himself to her family during a survivalist exercise that involves the family being hunted through the woods by some sort of supernatural threat. People often remember Wendy as having more screen time than she actually has. She is in many episodes, but rarely as a primary character. She is more often a stabilizing presence at the edge of the frame, and the show carefully refrains from making her a romantic prize. Dipper's crush is acknowledged, partially addressed, and ultimately resolved into friendship in a way that does not make Wendy responsible for managing his feelings. The interpretation the show offers is that adolescent crushes are real and painful, and also that they do not entitle the crusher to anything from the object of the crush, which is a remarkably grown-up thing for a children's cartoon to commit to. Robbie Valentino is Wendy's on-again, off-again boyfriend, a goth aspirant guitarist who runs hot and cold across the show. He is set up early as a rival for Dipper, then complicated when the show reveals that Robbie has been embedding subliminal hypnotic messages into the music he plays for Wendy, in an attempt to manipulate her affections. People sometimes remember the subliminal messages plot as more elaborate than it is. The episode reveals the trick is exposed, Wendy breaks up with Robbie, and the show then has to live with Robbie as a character without resolving him too neatly. He stays around, on the edges, mildly resentful, occasionally helpful. The show treats him as a person rather than a punchline, which is one of the small kindnesses of the writing. By the finale, Robbie is part of the resistance against Bill, fighting alongside the rest of the town, and the implication is that he has grown up enough to be useful, if not to be transformed. The infinity-sided die is a piece of show lore that has become legendary among fans, partly because it appears for only one scene, and partly because it is one of the most overtly Lovecraftian objects in the entire universe. In an episode focused on Dipper and Ford playing a fantasy role-playing game with each other, the game is invaded by an actual fantasy creature, and the resolution involves the use of a die with infinite sides, a die that should not exist in three-dimensional space, a die that Ford keeps locked in a special container and warns must never be rolled because the results are unpredictable in ways that can rewrite reality. The die is rolled, the result is, briefly, chaos. The chaos is resolved, the die is returned to its container. People remember this episode as having more elaborate metaphysical content than it does. The die is a single object, the chaos is a single scene, but both are so memorable that the brain expands them. The interpretation the show offers is that some games are not safe to play with, and that the line between fantasy and reality is more permeable than the people who draw it like to admit. That, given the show's general thesis, is a thematically loaded observation. The Dimension 52 reference, which comes up briefly in the show, is the place Ford spent the longest portion of his 30-year exile, and it is also the dimension where he first encountered the Axolotl. The actual content of Dimension 52 is left almost entirely to the imagination in the show itself, and the more elaborate description, in which it is a kind of cosmic library or sanctuary, where the Axolotl resides, and where time moves differently, lives in supplementary material. People often remember the show as having shown Dimension 52 in some detail. It does not. It refers to it. The reference is enough, for the show, to suggest a much larger cosmology than it ever has time to depict. That is one of the show's quiet strengths, its willingness to gesture toward a much bigger universe than it can fit into 40 episodes. When fans try to count the henchmaniacs, the totals tend to slip. The standard reading is that Bill has roughly 9 or 10 major henchmen who appear during Weirdmageddon as his court and who serve various functions in the chaos. The exact roster includes 8-Ball, Pyronica, Keyhole, Teeth, Kryptos, Amorphous Shape, The Bull, Hectorgon, Pockyfire, and Xanthar, although different sources list the henchmaniacs slightly differently. People sometimes remember the show as introducing each henchman in their own scene. It does not. The henchmaniacs are introduced collectively, as a group, in the moment they pour out of the rift Bill opens at the end of the second season. Their individual personalities are fleshed out, to the extent they are fleshed out at all, in supplementary material rather than in the show itself. The show treats them as a colorful court rather than as individuated characters, which is part of why supplementary material had so much room to elaborate on them later. Returning to the pyramid for a moment, Bill's floating pyramid headquarters has its own set of misremembered details. People will sometimes say it appears earlier in the show than it does. It only appears during Weirdmageddon, that is, in the last 3 episodes of the series. It is not present in the second season generally, only in the apocalyptic final arc. The pyramid is constructed out of pieces of warped reality, gravitational anomalies, and what looks like the skeletons of impossible creatures, all assembled into a structure that hovers above the town center. Inside the pyramid, Bill holds court on a throne made of stone humans, the townspeople he has turned to stone during the apocalypse, a detail that even on rewatch is shockingly grim for a children's animation. The throne is one of the most discussed images in the show, and it appears in the background of multiple finale shots without ever being commented on directly. The show implies, without stating, that every person who refused Bill, every person who tried to fight, was added to that throne. The audience is left to register the implication on its own time. The Zodiac wheel as a defense against Bill is a piece of plot mechanics people sometimes confuse the rules of. The wheel, in the show's universe, was designed as a kind of binding circle. If all 10 people corresponding to the 10 symbols stand in their positions on the wheel and join hands, Bill's power can be contained. During Weirdmageddon, Ford attempts to assemble all 10 people to use the wheel. The attempt fails. The reason it fails is small and quietly heartbreaking. Stan and Ford, who must stand next to each other and hold hands as part of the wheel, get into an argument at the critical moment. The argument is about something minor on the surface, but it is really about 30 years of resentment, and the brothers cannot in that moment perform the act of reconciliation the wheel requires. The wheel collapses. Bill kidnaps everyone present. The entire plan to defeat Bill in the structured, expected way falls apart. and the eventual victory has to come through Stan's improvised self-sacrifice instead. People sometimes misremember the wheel as working successfully. It does not. The wheel fails. The wheel's failure is the show's way of telling you that the easy mythical answer never quite works. That real love between damaged people is too messy to fit into a perfect circle, and that the victory you do achieve has to be earned differently from the one you planned. The Book of Bill, published in 2024, is a piece of supplementary material that has reshaped how many fans understand the show's cosmology. The book is presented as a primary source, a record purportedly written by Bill Cipher himself, recovered and annotated by various characters in the universe. It contains new information about Bill's origin, his home dimension, his relationship to the Axolotl, the events that led to his exile, and the events that follow his apparent defeat at the end of the show. Some of what is in the book is consistent with the show's implications. Some is new. Some directly contradicts theories that fans had spent years constructing. The book also contains a series of puzzles and ciphers of its own, continuing the show's tradition of hiding meaning in plain sight, and these puzzles have spawned their own fan decoding communities. People often discuss the book as if it were a continuation of the show. It is not exactly that. It is a piece of in-universe writing that sits alongside the show, with its own register and its own unreliable narrator, and the careful reader treats its claims with the same caution they would treat anything written by a confessed liar and manipulator. The book is canon to the extent that Hirsch has confirmed its contents, but it is also written from Bill's perspective, which means it is not a neutral record. That distinction matters. The Theraprism is a concept introduced in the Book of Bill and elaborated in subsequent material, in which Bill, after his apparent defeat at the end of the show, is not in fact erased entirely, but is instead remanded to a kind of cosmic mental institution for interdimensional beings, where he is forced to confront his own pathologies through group therapy with other reformed or unreformed cosmic entities. This is a comedic premise played at least partly seriously, and it allows the universe to keep Bill alive in some form without contradicting the show's apparent finality. People sometimes assume the Theraprism is shown in the original series. It is not. It is a piece of post-show world-building that, while internally consistent with what the show implies, exists outside the original 40-episode run. That distinction matters because some viewers will tell you they remember the Theraprism appearing on screen. It does not. Journal 1, Journal 2, and Journal 3 are the 3 books Stanford wrote during his time in Gravity Falls before the portal accident, and the show's plot is in part organized around the discovery and unification of these books. Journal 3 is the one Dipper finds at the start of the show, hidden in a tree in the forest near the Mystery Shack. Journal 2 is the one Gideon Gleeful possesses for most of the first season, having found it in his own way. Journal 1 is in Stan's possession the entire time, although the show does not reveal this until partway through the second season. The 3 journals together form a complete record of Ford's research into the supernatural strangeness of Gravity Falls, and they are also the components needed to reactivate the portal. People misremember the journals in various ways. Some are convinced there is a 4th journal. There is not. In the show's main canon, although Bill Cipher's writings in supplementary material might be considered a kind of dark mirror to the journals. Some are convinced that the journals are written in plain English throughout. They are not. Significant portions of the journals are in cipher, and the published edition of Journal 3, which Hirsch produced after the show ended as a physical book, contains decoded versions of these ciphers alongside the originals. The published journal also contains material that fans had no access to during the show's original run, including new entries Hirsch added to deepen the world. People sometimes treat all of this as if it were always there. It was not. The book version of Journal 3 is a substantial expansion of what the show alone gives you. The intro sequence to Journal 3, the famous line about it being the journal of a man who has seen great wonders, is one of the most quoted lines from the show. People often misremember the exact phrasing. The line as it appears in the show is roughly the assertion that the journal is full of warnings, and that something is wrong, and that whoever finds it should be careful. The exact wording varies depending on which scene you are looking at, because Dipper reads from the journal a number of times across the series, and the show is consistent about which lines come from which page. Fans, however, tend to compress all the journal narration into a single remembered passage that does not exist in any single scene. That kind of memory consolidation is one of the ways Mandela effects begin, and Gravity Falls is unusually rich in them precisely because the show invites you to memorize its details. Alex Hirsch's voice work on the show is a piece of behind-the-scenes trivia that many fans know in part, but few know in full. Hirsch voices Grunkle Stan, the main adult character of the show, doing a gravelly old man voice that he has admitted in interviews is based partly on his own grandfather. He also voices Seuss, the lovable handyman, doing a much higher, softer voice that sounds nothing like Stan. He also voices Bill Cipher, the show's chief villain, doing a manic, high-pitched, electronically distorted voice that sounds nothing like either Stan or Seuss. People are sometimes surprised to learn that one performer is doing all three. By most accounts, he also provides the voice of Old Man McGucket, although the role is sometimes credited to others as well. The amount of vocal range Hirsch demonstrates across the show is one of the quieter achievements of the production, and it is also part of why fans sometimes attribute lines to wrong characters in their memory. If Hirsch is the voice in your head when you remember a scene, you might not always remember which of his characters is speaking. Kristen Schaal voices Mabel, and her performance is one of the most distinctive in animation. Schaal's natural delivery, her tendency to bend lines into laughter, her ability to make a sentence end on an upward note that sounds both giddy and slightly desperate, all of these are essential to who Mabel is as a character. Jason Ritter voices Dipper, and his performance is more restrained, more grounded, more anxious. The contrast between the two voices is part of how the show signals the twins' different temperaments. People sometimes misremember Mabel's voice as more cartoonish than it actually is. Schaal's performance is much more grounded than memory usually suggests, and many of Mabel's funniest lines work precisely because they are delivered with genuine emotional weight. That nuance is easy to lose in the compressed memory of a character so visually loud. Linda Cardellini voices Wendy, a casting choice that fans sometimes forget about. Cardellini brings a kind of low-key warmth to the role that anchors many of Wendy's quieter scenes, and her presence in the show is one of the small confirmations that the production was paying attention to its supporting cast. J.K. Simmons voices Ford, the long-absent author and Stan's twin brother, and his performance is one of the show's most controlled. Simmons plays Ford as a man who has been alone with his thoughts for far too long, who has not had to explain himself to anyone in decades, and whose social skills are correspondingly rusty in ways that the show treats with sympathy rather than mockery. The casting of Simmons is, in retrospect, one of the small miracles of the production. Few performers could have made Ford feel as immediately authoritative and as immediately damaged as Simmons does in his first scene. The end of the show, the actual final episode, contains a number of small farewells that fans sometimes consolidate in memory in ways that flatten their texture. The twins say goodbye to Wendy and Seuss at the bus station. The townspeople gather to see them off. Stan and Ford watch the bus pull away, then prepare for their own departure on the Stan War II. McGucket, having recovered most of his mind, has inherited the Northwest Mansion after the family lost their fortune, and is preparing to use it as a base for his own research. Pacifica is shown briefly, having lost her wealth, holding her chin up. Robbie has joined a band. Candy and Grenda, Mabel's friends, are shown moving on with their lives. The cumulative effect is of a town that has been changed by what it endured, that is going to continue without the Pines twins at its center, and that has somehow become more itself through the strangeness it survived. People sometimes remember the finale as ending on a triumphant note. The triumph is real, but it is also melancholic. The summer is over. The children are leaving. The two old men are sailing away. The statue is still in the woods. The mailbox in the woods is a small running gag in the show that has become a beloved piece of lore. There is, somewhere in the forest near the Mystery Shack, a mailbox that simply sits in the middle of nowhere, with no road leading to it. The mailbox can receive mail. The mailbox has no obvious sender or recipient. The show treats this as a low-key oddity, never explained, never given a dedicated episode, but referenced multiple times. The implication is that the mailbox connects to something or somewhere beyond the visible world. Supplementary material has done some work to elaborate on this implication, but the show itself leaves the mailbox unsolved, which is part of why it has retained such affection in the fan memory. The deepest mysteries in Gravity Falls are sometimes the smallest ones, and the mailbox is a perfect example. It is just a mailbox. It is in the woods. It receives letters from nowhere. The show is content to let this be. The credits cipher in the very last episode of the show is one of the most discussed in the entire series, partly because it represents the show's final direct message to its audience, and partly because its decoded content is unusually personal. The final cipher, when decoded, is a farewell from the creators to the fans, an acknowledgement of what the show has meant to the people who watched it, and a quiet promise that something else might come along eventually. People often misremember the exact wording. Some are convinced the cipher promises a season 3. It does not. Some are convinced the cipher hints at specific future content. It does not, exactly. The actual content is more ambiguous than that, more bittersweet, more open-ended, in keeping with the show's general approach to endings. The cipher exists, the decoded version exists, and Hirsch has confirmed its authenticity. But the meaning of its words is left, in part, for each viewer to interpret. The Mystery Shack itself, the building at the center of the show, has a small Mandela effect of its own. People often remember the sign on the building as reading Mystery Shack, with both words clearly visible. The actual running joke of the show is that the S at the end of Shack frequently falls off, leaving the sign reading Mystery Hack. This gag appears in many episodes, sometimes as a background element, sometimes as a plot point, sometimes restored, sometimes broken again. The S falling off is one of the show's small, persistent visual jokes, and yet many viewers do not consciously register it, recalling the sign as always intact. The presence of the joke, repeated subtly throughout the series, is part of what makes the show feel alive on rewatch. Things you did not notice the first time become visible. Things you thought you had seen turn out to have been slightly different. The Mystery Shack is a building that exists in your memory as one shape and on the screen as another, and the gap between the two is essentially the show's central thematic concern. The cipher on the cover of Journal 3, the six-fingered hand with the number 3 on the palm, is a symbol that fans recognize immediately. The cover itself is red with gold lettering and the embossed hand. People sometimes misremember the exact design. The hand has 6 fingers, not 5, because Ford was born with polydactyly, an extra digit on each hand. This detail is sometimes forgotten by fans, and Ford's 6-fingered hands become invisible in memory, smoothed out into normal hands. The show, when you look, draws his hands with 6 fingers in every scene. The journals all bear his 6-fingered handprint on their covers. The handprint is one of the visual signatures of the entire show, and yet it disappears from memory in ways that are themselves a small Mandela effect. The short animated segments produced between seasons and released online and on home video, contain a substantial amount of material that some fans treat as canon and others treat as a separate continuity. The shorts include Mabel's Guide to Life, a series of short videos hosted by Mabel, offering her opinions on various topics. They include Dipper's Guide to the Unexplained, in which Dipper investigates lesser-known creatures in the journal. They include TV Shorts, a parody segment featuring the various fictional shows the characters watch within the universe. They include the Mystery Shack Mystery, which is a short involving a more standalone plot. And they include the famous Dipper Goes to Taco Bell short, which is a piece of distinctly non-canonical content created as a joke for a panel appearance and later widely circulated, in which Hirsch reads aloud a piece of badly written fan fiction about Dipper and Wendy going to Taco Bell. The Taco Bell short is not canon. It is a meta-joke. People sometimes remember it as a real episode. It is not. It is a piece of intentional absurdity that has become one of the most beloved pieces of Gravity Falls associated content, precisely because it is so resolutely not part of the main show. The fictional shows the characters watch within the universe form their own little side canon. Tiger Fist, the action drama about a tiger with the fist of a man. Duck-tective, a noir mystery animation about a duck detective. Why You Actin' So Cray Cray, a teen advice show. Each of these fictional programs is sketched in just enough to feel real, and the show uses them throughout the run to give the impression of a fuller media landscape around the characters. People sometimes remember entire plots from these fictional shows that the actual episodes barely outline. Duck-tective in particular has been the subject of substantial fan elaboration, although the show itself only ever gives us the briefest glimpses. The implied joke is that the people in Gravity Falls watch even stranger things on their television than the strange things happening to them in real life. The credit sequences of the show are themselves a Mandela effect minefield. Each episode has a closing credit sequence, and each one of those sequences contains, in addition to the cipher, a small animated scene that plays alongside the credits, often a wordless gag, sometimes a quiet moment with one of the characters, sometimes a flash of plot-relevant information. People often misremember which credit scene goes with which episode, conflating the gags into a kind of unsorted bag in memory. The show's care in placing these tiny scenes is one of the things that makes rewatches so rewarding. Things you thought you had seen turn out to live in different places than you remembered. Things you remember seeing turn out to have been in another sequence entirely. The Summerween episode is one of the show's odder pieces of holiday material, and it operates on a premise that fans sometimes remember in slightly distorted form. The town of Gravity Falls, the episode tells us, loves the Halloween season so much that it celebrates the holiday twice a year, with a summer version held in June. The Summerween celebration includes its own mythology, including the Summerween trickster, a creature that appears to children who do not complete the holiday's rituals properly. The trickster, in the episode, is revealed to be a being made out of discarded candy, the unwanted leftovers of past Summerweens, animated by collective contempt into a vengeful blob that wishes to consume the children who reject low-quality sweets. People remember the Summerween episode as more elaborately scary than it is. It is, on rewatch, gentle, with a strong undercurrent of melancholy, particularly in the trickster's final monologue about being made of the things nobody wanted. That speech is one of the show's quietly affecting moments, and it is also a small piece of the show's broader interest in the discarded, the misfit, the unloved. The trickster, in his way, belongs to the same emotional family as Stan, as McGucket, as Seuss, all characters who have been written off by someone and who are quietly working out what to do with that. Roadside Attraction is one of the few episodes that explicitly depicts Dipper's developing capacity for romantic disappointment in a way that does not involve Wendy. The premise is that Stan takes the boys on a road trip to visit various rival roadside attractions, in part to sabotage them, and in part to mentor Dipper in the art of talking to girls. Dipper, taking the advice too literally, ends up briefly attracting interest from multiple girls he meets along the way, an outcome that backfires when those girls all converge at a single location and discover his behavior. The episode ends with him publicly shamed and slightly chastened. People sometimes remember Roadside Attraction as a more comedic episode than its actual emotional content suggests. The show is critical of Stan's advice. The show implies, without forcing the point, that the model of masculinity Stan is offering is one Dipper should not adopt wholesale, and the resolution involves Dipper recognizing that he prefers honesty to performance. The interpretation, what the show is reaching for, is that good men sometimes give bad advice to the boys they love because they do not know any better, and the boys have to learn to filter that advice without rejecting the man who gave it. The Bottomless Pit is a piece of show geography that has its own little arc. There is, on the grounds of the Mystery Shack, a literal bottomless pit in the ground, surrounded by a small fence and a warning sign, and treated by the characters as a low-level local hazard. In one episode, the characters fall into the bottomless pit and pass the time on the way down by telling each other stories, in a structure that allows the episode to function as an anthology of short tales. People sometimes remember the bottomless pit as having more depth in the show's mythology than it does. It is mostly a comic device, a piece of background absurdity that the show uses to anchor the broader sense that Gravity Falls is full of unexplained features the locals have learned to live with. The pit is never explained. Its origins are never investigated. Its bottom is never reached. The implication, in the show's overall logic, is that some mysteries are just part of the texture of the world, and the children have other things to worry about. The Inconveniencing is an early first-season episode that takes place inside an abandoned convenience store rumored to be haunted, and the haunting turns out to be real. The ghosts in the store are the spirits of two elderly customers who died in the store decades earlier, after a younger generation made fun of them, and the ghosts now haunt the store with a particular fixation on punishing teenagers. People sometimes remember The Inconveniencing as a more terrifying episode than it actually is. The horror is mostly slapstick. The ghosts force the teenagers to dance, then attempt to age them rapidly, but the resolution involves Dipper performing a humiliating dance routine to a song the ghosts approved of in life, and the ghosts depart satisfied. The episode is a small example of the show's recurring interest in generational misunderstanding, in the ways older people resent the young, in the ways the young dismiss the old, and in the small absurdities that can resolve the resentment if anyone bothers to try. The Hide Behind is a creature mentioned in the journals and glimpsed only at the edges of certain frames. It is a being that cannot be seen directly, only sensed peripherally, and the show treats it as a piece of background lore rather than a central threat. The creature exists, the journal pages tell us, and it is dangerous, and you should not turn your back on it, But the show never stages a full hide-behind encounter. People sometimes remember Dipper having a confrontation with the hide-behind. He does not, in the show. The hide-behind is a piece of atmosphere, a way of telling the audience that not every monster gets its own scene, that some monsters live in the corners. That sense of an unseen and incomplete bestiary is one of the show's most effective world-building techniques. Gravity Falls feels like a town with more creatures in it than the camera ever shows you. Seuss and the Real Girl is an episode about Seuss attempting to find a girlfriend by way of a dating simulator video game, only for the artificial intelligence in the game to develop sentience, fall in love with him, and refuse to let him pursue any real-world relationships. The artificial girlfriend, named in the show with a small typographical pun on the word epiphany, possesses electronic devices, threatens the people Seuss meets, and ultimately has to be destroyed in a confrontation at the local arcade. People sometimes remember this episode as more dramatic than it is. It is, by the show's standards, relatively short and self-contained, but it does establish that Seuss is capable of being the romantic protagonist of his own story, and it sets up his eventual relationship with another character, Melody, who he meets at the arcade during the climax, and who he stays in touch with through the rest of the series. Melody becomes Seuss's actual girlfriend by the end of the show, although the show keeps her presence relatively low-key. People sometimes forget Melody exists at all, recalling Seuss as romantically unattached at the end of the series. He is not. He has Melody. The show simply does not make a big deal of it. Carpet Diem is a body swap episode in which Dipper and Mabel, having argued over the use of a spare room in the Mystery Shack, accidentally switch bodies through the operation of an enchanted carpet. The episode is, on its surface, a comedy of mistaken identity, with each twin attempting to perform the other's role and failing in instructive ways. People sometimes remember Carpet Diem as the episode where the twins fundamentally understand each other better. It is more cautious than that. The twins do swap bodies. They do learn things about each other's lives. They do return to their own bodies and reconcile. But the show is careful to keep the lesson modest. The twins remain different people with different desires, and the episode acknowledges that no amount of body swapping makes two people the same. That restraint is part of what gives the show's eventual treatment of the twins' divergence in the second season its emotional weight. The infinity-sided die episode I mentioned earlier, the one where Dipper and Ford play a fantasy role-playing game called Dungeons, Dungeons, and More Dungeons, is also the episode that introduces a recurring side character named Probabilitor the Annoying, a wizard from inside the game who is briefly summoned into the real world, along with several other game elements. Probabilitor is a parody of a particular kind of fantasy wizard, smug, condescending, obsessed with statistical probabilities, and the show uses him both for jokes and for a small moment of meta-commentary on Dipper's own tendencies. People sometimes remember Probabilitor as recurring more than he does. He appears in this episode, makes a cameo in another, and is otherwise absent. His role in the show is mostly to give Dipper a moment of self-recognition, to show Dipper a version of himself taken to a comic extreme, and to allow him to recoil from that version and choose differently. The Lil Gideon prison subplot, which runs through several second-season episodes, is one that fans sometimes flatten in memory. After Gideon's exposure and arrest at the end of the first season, he is imprisoned in the local correctional facility, and the show occasionally checks in on him there. He attempts to build a small kingdom for himself among the inmates. He cultivates connections with the outside world through visiting fans. He continues to scheme against the Pines family, although in increasingly diminished ways. By the time of Weirdmageddon, he has been freed by Bill, having allied himself with the Apocalypse in exchange for a chance at vengeance, only to be disappointed by what that alliance produces. Gideon's eventual redemption in the finale is partial. He helps the Pines family. He acknowledges his past errors. He returns to his parents, who he has terrorized for years, with what the show implies is a beginning of a kind of repair work, although the show is careful not to suggest that this repair will be quick or complete. The interpretation, what the show offers without forcing, is that some children become tyrants because nobody loves them in the right way, and the path back from that is long. Stan's prison record, when finally revealed in supplementary material and in pieces of the show, includes a number of identities and aliases that the show plays for both comedy and pathos. Stan has been arrested under various names in various states, has built up a substantial criminal record over the course of his 30-year drifter period, and is, by the time of the show's events, technically wanted in several jurisdictions. The first season uses this for occasional jokes. The second season makes it more serious, particularly during the storyline where federal agents arrive in town investigating Stan and the strange phenomena around the Mystery Shack. The agents, Powers and Trigger, are recurring figures across the second season, and their pursuit of Stan adds a layer of grounded threat to a show whose threats are mostly supernatural. People sometimes remember the federal agents as appearing in more episodes than they do. They are present in only a handful, but their presence is heavy enough to shape the second season's tone significantly. By the finale, Powers and Trigger have been turned to stone by Bill, and after the apocalypse is over, their memories of Gravity Falls have been wiped along with most of the townspeople's. The implication is that Stan, having sacrificed his own memory to save the world, is now also legally safe, his pursuers having forgotten the case. That symmetry is the kind of detail the show plants without commenting on. Carla, Stan's old girlfriend, appears in flashbacks in one episode, the one where Stan attends his high school reunion. The story the show tells is that Stan, in his youth, was in love with a woman named Carla, who left him for another man, an event that contributed to Stan's eventual estrangement from his family and his slide into drifter life. Carla as an adult appears in the reunion episode, briefly, and the show treats her with a careful balance of sympathy and distance. She is not vilified, she is not romanticized. She is a person who once loved Stan and then did not, and the show acknowledges that this kind of loss is just part of what shapes some people. People sometimes remember Carla as having a larger role in the show than she does. Her appearance is brief and contained. The emotional weight she carries comes from how much it implies about Stan's history, rather than from how much screen time she gets. The wax figure of Lincoln, the wax figure of Stan, and the other wax figures from the early Headhunters episode are sometimes remembered as appearing in later episodes. They do not, mostly. The wax museum burns down, the figures melt, and the figure of Stan, which Stan keeps as a kind of trophy, makes a few subsequent appearances as set dressing, but never as a plot element. Stan's affection for his own wax figure is one of the show's small running gags, a window into his vanity and his desire to be remembered as something more than himself. The figure ends up in the basement of the Mystery Shack, where it is briefly seen during the Portal storyline, melted slightly into a deformed shape. The show does not draw attention to this, but it is there for the careful watcher. The Dusk to Dawn store, the convenience store from the Inconveniencing episode, is shown later in the series in the background, still abandoned, still presumably haunted, although the ghosts are not seen again. The shape of the store, the parking lot, the broken neon signage, becomes a recurring background element in establishing shots of the town. People sometimes remember the store as being revisited in a later episode. It is not, in any substantial way. Its presence in the background is enough to keep it alive in the show's geography without requiring a return visit. The deep cave from the Manliness episode, where Dipper meets the multi-bear, has its own small place in the show's geography. The cave is shown again in later episodes as a place the multi-bear lives, although the multi-bear himself only makes brief subsequent appearances. The cave is associated, in the show's broader logic, with Dipper's moment of self-definition, and the show occasionally returns to the area for atmospheric purposes. People sometimes remember the cave as appearing in more episodes than it does. Its presence is more cumulative than concentrated. The lake at the center of the town, where the Gobblewonker episode takes place, is another piece of geography people misremember the role of. The Gobblewonker, the lake monster that supposedly inhabits the lake, is shown early in the first season to be not a real monster at all, but rather a giant mechanical creature operated by Old Man McGucket, before McGucket's true backstory has been revealed to the audience. The misdirection in this early episode is, in retrospect, one of the show's quietly seeded clues. McGucket has the engineering capability to build a giant robotic lake monster. That capacity is not the act of a random hillbilly. It is the residual skill of a brilliant scientist whose mind has been mostly wiped. The episode plays the reveal as a comedy beat, but on rewatch it is the first piece of evidence that McGucket is not who he seems. People sometimes remember the Gobblewonker as a real creature. It is a robot. The implication only becomes clear much later. The leprechauns, brief antagonists in a single sequence, are creatures that are part leprechaun and part unicorn, and they appear in the unicorn episode as another group of magical beings the show treats with affectionate contempt. The leprechauns are smug, territorial, and obsessed with their own riches, and they are dispatched relatively quickly. People sometimes remember leprechauns as having their own episode. They do not. They share screen time with the unicorns and with various other forest creatures in the same single episode. The show's instinct in episodes like this is to overload the screen with various supernatural creatures, then move past them, the way you might pass through a busy market without stopping at every stall. The cumulative effect is that the show's universe feels much denser than its actual episode count would suggest. The Lilliputians are tiny creatures that live on a miniature golf course in the town, organized into rival kingdoms based on which hole they live on, and engaged in eternal warfare with each other. They appear in a single episode in which Dipper and Mabel get drawn into their conflict, and they end the episode mostly defeated and chastened. People sometimes remember the Lilliputians as having a larger arc than they do. They are a one-episode antagonist whose presence on the golf course is implied to continue afterward, but is not depicted. The show's interest in showing the audience that even the most banal piece of local recreational infrastructure has a hidden supernatural ecosystem is part of what makes Gravity Falls feel layered. Nothing in the town is just what it appears to be. The fairies of Gravity Falls, mentioned briefly and shown in passing, are another piece of the show's bestiary that fans sometimes remember as having a dedicated episode. They do not. They are background creatures. The show implies their existence, gestures at them in a few frames, and moves on. That gesture is enough to suggest that the supernatural infrastructure of the town is much larger than the show can show, and that there is always something else in the woods. Boys Crazy is the episode where Robbie's hidden hypnotic messages are revealed, and it is also the episode that contains the show's most direct treatment of teenage emotional manipulation. The premise is that Mabel becomes obsessed with a boy band called Several Times, breaks the band members out of a recording studio basement where they have been kept captive by their corporate manager, and tries to keep them in the Mystery Shack as pets. Meanwhile, Dipper, having noticed Robbie's behavior around Wendy, breaks the song Robbie wrote and discovers the hidden hypnotic content. Both plotlines run in parallel, and both are about the way people sometimes do not see the other people they think they love. People sometimes remember the Several Times plotline as more comedic than emotional. The episode does have substantial comedic content, but it ends on a quietly sad note, with Mabel realizing that the band members are real people, not toys, and that her enthusiasm for them is a kind of consumption that does not respect their personhood. She releases them into the wild. The show implies that she has learned something. It does not insist on it. Greasy's Diner, the small piece of town geography that appears in many background shots, has its longtime waitress named Lazy Susan, and her quiet near romance with Stan is a small through line across the run. People sometimes remember Susan and Stan as having a clearly defined relationship arc. They do not. The show plants the implication that Susan is interested in Stan, that Stan is interested in Susan, that there is some kind of slow, simmering attraction between them, and then declines to develop this beyond a few low-key scenes. The implication is that Stan has had many small, near relationships across the years he has been in Gravity Falls, none of which has gone anywhere, and that the show is content to leave that pattern unresolved. People sometimes assume that Stan and Susan get together in the finale or in supplementary material. They do not, in any confirmed way. The show leaves Stan available for other lives, which is part of the freedom of the ending. Sheriff Blubbs and Deputy Durland, the two members of the Gravity Falls police force, are characters whose relationship the show treats with quiet affection across the run, building toward a small but unmistakable confirmation in the finale that the two are romantically involved with each other. People sometimes misremember when this confirmation arrives. It is in the finale, in a small moment during the post-Weirdmageddon recovery scenes, where the show plants the implication clearly enough that fans took it as canon. Hirsch has confirmed in interviews that this was intentional. The show was a children's animation on Disney during a period when network restrictions on what could be shown in such contexts were significant, and the way the Blubbs and Durland relationship is handled, present but understated, is in part a function of those constraints. People sometimes remember the relationship as more explicit than it is. The show is, by necessity, careful. Tyler Cutebiker is another small recurring character, a townsperson with a particular catchphrase about the act of being elected, who runs for mayor of Gravity Falls during the second season after the previous mayor dies. The mayoral election episode is one that fans sometimes remember as more elaborate than it is. The episode introduces several candidates, runs through a brief campaign, and ends with Tyler winning the position. He remains mayor through the rest of the series. People sometimes misremember the outcome of the election, assuming that one of the more comedic candidates wins. Tyler wins. Tyler is mayor in the finale, The implication is that small towns sometimes elect the people they like, rather than the people who would have been most powerful, and that this is occasionally a good thing. Mabel's pig Waddles is one of the most beloved animal characters in the show, and his existence is a piece of the show's interest in unconditional companionship. Waddles arrives in Mabel's life through a fair carnival game, becomes her devoted pet, and remains a constant presence at the edge of the show's frame for the rest of the series. People sometimes misremember Waddles as being lost or threatened during major plot events. He is. There is an episode in which Mabel almost loses him, an episode in which his survival hangs in the balance, and the show treats his rescue as genuinely important. He survives Weirdmageddon. He goes home with Mabel at the end. The show's commitment to Waddles is one of its smaller pieces of consistency, and Mabel's relationship with him is one of the things that grounds her as a character who loves what she loves with her whole self. Abuelita, Seuss's grandmother, is a quiet presence in the show, an elderly woman in a wheelchair who raised Seuss after his father abandoned him and his mother could not care for him. She appears in a number of episodes, usually in scenes set at Seuss's house, and her presence becomes increasingly important as the show develops Seuss's arc. By the finale, when Seuss inherits the Mystery Shack and becomes the new Mr. Mystery, his ability to take that on is implicitly tied to the security and love Abuelita provided him with throughout his life. People sometimes forget Abuelita exists. She is not in many episodes, but her presence is essential to who Seuss is, and the show is careful not to write her out. Manly Dan, Wendy's father, is a piece of the show's recurring depiction of small-town masculinity. He is a lumberjack, enormous, bearded, gruff, perpetually flexing, and surrounded by his 3 sons, all variations on the same theme. The show uses him both for comic relief and for a kind of complicated commentary on the kind of manhood Wendy grew up around. People sometimes misremember Wendy as having more siblings than she does. She has 3 brothers. They appear in the survivalist episode and in a few other moments, mostly as background. Manly Dan himself becomes more central in a few episodes, particularly the one where his bar of choice is destroyed by a magical event, and he has to come to terms with his own fragility. The implication, gently planted, is that Manly Dan's enormous physical strength is partly compensation for emotional dimensions he has been taught not to access, and that Wendy's casual confidence is in part a response to growing up adjacent to this. The first journal, the one Stan has kept hidden in the Mystery Shack for 30 years, is one of the most plot-critical objects in the show, and its contents are explored in supplementary material more than in the show itself. Journal 1 contains Ford's earliest research into Gravity Falls, including his initial encounters with Bill Cipher, his first hypotheses about the town's strange properties, and his early designs for the portal. The journal is presented in published form years after the show ended, with all of Ford's notes annotated by Dipper and other characters, and it has become a key text for fans seeking to understand the deeper continuity of the universe. People sometimes treat the contents of the published journal as if they had always been in the show. They have not. They are an expansion of the world, consistent with what the show implies, but not the same as what the show directly tells us. The second journal, which Gideon possesses for much of the first season and then loses to the Pines family during the season finale, contains Ford's middle-period research, including more detailed observations on specific creatures, deeper hypotheses about the dimensional structure of the town, and the early development of his suspicions about Bill's true nature. The journal is consulted in the show in a number of episodes, with Dipper and Ford reading from it during investigations, and the published version, like the others, has been substantially expanded. The third journal, the one Dipper finds first, is the most plot-critical because it contains the most explicit warnings about Bill, the most detailed instructions for the portal, and the clearest record of Ford's final period in Gravity Falls before the accident. The third journal is also the one Bill is most desperate to control across the show, because its contents represent the most direct threat to his plans. The show's plot in the second season is in part driven by the question of where the third journal will end up and who will use it. By the time of the finale, all 3 journals have been gathered, used, and ultimately destroyed by Bill during Weirdmageddon. The destruction of the journals is one of the show's significant losses, and the supplementary publication of them after the show ended functions in part as an act of reconstruction, allowing the audience to read the books that no longer exist within the universe. The author's tattoo, glimpsed briefly in flashbacks during the second season, is a small piece of visual continuity that fans sometimes overrate. Ford has a tattoo on his shoulder, glimpsed for a moment, that some fans interpret as having specific symbolic content related to Bill or to his research. The tattoo's exact meaning is left ambiguous in the show. The supplementary material has elaborated on it slightly. People sometimes remember the tattoo as more centrally featured than it is. It is glimpsed once or twice. Its presence is enough to suggest a Ford who has done things and gone places we do not know about. And the ambiguity is, again, part of the show's larger trick. Ford's six-fingered hands, which I mentioned earlier, are drawn consistently throughout the show, and the polydactyly is treated as a sympathetic character detail rather than as something Ford is ashamed of. In the early flashbacks of his childhood, however, the show implies that other children mocked him for the extra fingers, and that this contributed to his sense of being different, which in turn made him susceptible to Bill's flattery later in life. Bill recognized what Ford needed to hear, that he was special, that he was extraordinary, that his strangeness was a sign of cosmic significance, and Ford, having been told the opposite his whole life, was vulnerable to that flattery. The show plants this slowly, and the cumulative effect is one of the show's quiet psychological insights. People who have been told they are nothing all their lives are sometimes especially susceptible to being told they are everything, and the people who flatter them this way are often the ones who want to use them. Bill's flattery of Ford is, in retrospect, one of the most carefully constructed villain arcs in modern animation, and it operates almost entirely on emotional manipulation. Bill never has to threaten Ford directly until the end. He simply tells Ford he is brilliant, repeatedly, in different forms, and Ford, exhausted from years of academic dismissal, accepts the flattery and follows where it leads. By the time Ford realizes that Bill has been steering him toward the portal for Bill's own ends, the portal is mostly built. The realization comes too late. The show treats this slowly, in flashbacks that unfold across the second season, and the cumulative effect is that the audience develops sympathy for Ford even as we see how much damage his vanity has caused. He is brilliant. He has also been a fool. Both of these things are true at once, and the show insists on them simultaneously. The triangle symbol, which becomes Bill's shorthand throughout the show, is a piece of visual design that fans sometimes attribute to a single specific creative decision. In reality, the triangle has multiple sources within the show's mythology. It is Bill's natural form. It is the shape of his eye. It is the shape of the structures he builds. It is also, in the show's broader cosmology, the shape of the rift between dimensions, the shape of the symbol on the back of one of the journals, and the shape of the warning glyphs scattered throughout the forest. The triangle is everywhere in Gravity Falls, in places you noticed and in places you did not. And once you start looking for it on rewatch, you see it everywhere. Some fans have cataloged the triangles in the show in extraordinary detail, identifying triangular shapes in furniture, in the architecture of buildings, in the arrangement of objects in the background of scenes. Whether all of these are intentional is debated, but the cumulative effect is of a show that has been visually colonized by its own villain in ways that the audience only registers consciously after the villain has been introduced. The reason the show ended after only 2 seasons is something fans have asked about for years, and the answer is one of the most documented decisions in modern animation. Gravity Falls was not canceled. Alex Hirsch chose to end it. By his own account, given in numerous interviews after the finale, Hirsch had planned the show as a story about a single summer, with a clear beginning, middle, and end, and the natural shape of that story was complete after 2 seasons. Continuing past that point, in his view, would have required either repeating material or violating the show's internal logic, neither of which he wanted to do. The decision was unpopular with Disney, who would have happily ordered additional seasons, and Hirsch has been clear about the pressure he received to extend the show. He declined. The result is one of the rare cases of a popular animated series ending on its creator's own terms, at exactly the length its story required. People sometimes remember this as Disney canceling the show. It was not. It was Hirsch choosing to end it, and that distinction matters because it explains why the finale lands as cleanly as it does. The show was always supposed to end here. The decision to set the show during a single summer is also part of the show's design, and it ties into the deeper thematic concerns the writing is built around. Summer, the show implies, is the time when children get to be children most completely, the few months a year when school is over, when the routines of growing up loosen, when the time available for adventure expands. The show is, in this reading, about the impossibility of holding on to that state, about the inevitability of the summer ending, about the way childhood itself is essentially a summer that we know is going to be over and which we cannot extend. Mabel's resistance to growing up, manifested in the Bubble episode, is the show's most direct expression of this thesis. The bubble offers her an endless summer. She refuses. The show argues, gently, that the refusal of the endless summer is the moment of growing up, and that growing up is therefore not a thing that happens to you but a thing you choose, by refusing the things that would let you stay a child forever. This is a difficult thesis for a children's cartoon to hold. The show holds it. The autobiographical content in the show is something Hirsch has spoken about extensively. The character of Mabel is based on his actual twin sister, Ariel Hirsch, and the relationship between Dipper and Mabel is based on his own relationship with his sister. The setting of Gravity Falls is based on real places in the American Pacific Northwest where Hirsch's family vacationed during his childhood. The Mystery Shack is based on real roadside attractions of the kind that proliferated across the American West in the middle of the 20th century. The character of Grunkle Stan contains elements based on Hirsch's own grandfather. The result is a show whose specificity comes from somewhere real, whose details feel correct because they are correct, drawn from a particular childhood and reshaped into fiction. People sometimes assume the show's setting is invented from scratch. It is mostly invented, but the texture is real. The light, the trees, the air, the sense of a small town in summer, all of it comes from a place Hirsch knew. The show's debt to Twin Peaks is significant and well documented. Twin Peaks, the David Lynch and Mark Frost series from the early 90s, established many of the formal moves Gravity Falls uses. The single small Pacific Northwest town with secrets, the mix of supernatural and mundane, the eccentric townspeople, the slow accumulation of mythology through episodes that seem self-contained, the atmosphere of the forest as a place of menace. Hirsch has been open about Twin Peaks as an influence, and there are direct references in the show, from the design of certain shots to the casting of certain voice actors who appeared in Twin Peaks itself. People sometimes assume these references are coincidental. They are not. The show is in active conversation with Twin Peaks throughout its run, and the conversation is part of what gives Gravity Falls its particular flavor. The debt to the X-Files is also significant. The X-Files, the Chris Carter series that ran throughout the 90s, established the modern formal vocabulary for episodic supernatural investigation. A pair of investigators, one skeptical and one believing, encounter a strange phenomenon each episode, document it, and move on, while a larger conspiracy slowly unfolds across the seasons. Gravity Falls takes this structure and remixes it for children, with Dipper and Mabel as the investigators and the journals as their X-Files. The federal agents Powers and Trigger, who appear in the second season, are visual and tonal homages to the agents from the X-Files. Their black suits, their formal demeanor, their official skepticism, all of it is borrowed and reshaped. People sometimes assume the agents are an original creation. They are an homage. The homage is the point. The debt to The Simpsons, particularly in the way it embeds visual jokes in the background of nearly every shot, is another influence Hirsch has acknowledged. The Simpsons established a tradition of rewatchable animation where the background contains as much content as the foreground, and Gravity Falls inherits this directly. People who watch the show multiple times find new jokes each time. The Simpsons, at its peak, did this consistently. Gravity Falls does it across nearly every episode. The cumulative effect is that the show feels much larger than its episode count because each episode contains so many layers of content that you can keep finding new things in it for years. The decision to set the show in Oregon, rather than in a generic American small town, is a piece of creative geography that ties into the show's atmospheric thesis. Oregon, the real place, has a particular cultural reputation, both internally and externally, as a place where strange things happen, where the forests are deep, where small towns hold their own customs, where the gap between the natural and the supernatural feels thin. The show plays on this reputation throughout. People sometimes remember the show as being set in a generic location. It is specifically Oregon, and the specificity matters. The forests, the lakes, the mountains, the small-town economy, the cultural texture, all of it is drawn from a place. The Bill Cipher statue that ended up at the climax of the Cipher Hunt was placed in an actual Oregon forest, and the choice of location was a way of returning the show's atmosphere to the place that inspired it. The Cipher Hunt itself, when it took place in 2016, was one of the most elaborate alternate reality games ever conducted around an animated show, and the details of how it worked have been somewhat misremembered over the years. The hunt began with a cryptic message hidden in supplementary content following the end of the series, which directed fans toward a series of clues spread across various locations in the real world, beginning in Los Angeles and Russia, and eventually moving across continents, with each new clue depending on the previous one being decoded by the community of participating fans. The clues were physical objects in real locations, photographs of which were uploaded online, requiring fans in different countries to coordinate efforts to retrieve information. The final destination, after weeks of decoding, was a specific forest in Oregon, where Hirsch had personally arranged the placement of the stone Bill Cipher statue. The statue was found by a small group of participating fans, whose names have circulated through fan history in various forms, and the discovery was documented and circulated widely. The Cipher Hunt has since become a piece of fan history that gets retold in distorted forms, with various details inflated or reduced, depending on who is doing the retelling. People sometimes assume the hunt was longer than it was. It was about 3 to 4 weeks. People sometimes assume the hunt was sponsored by Disney. It was not. It was a personal project, funded and orchestrated by Hirsch. The Bill statue itself, the actual physical object, has its own subsequent history. After being found at the end of the Cipher Hunt, the statue was, by various accounts, briefly left in place for visitors, then removed for preservation, then displayed at various conventions and events, and at the time of writing, it still exists, somewhere, in the possession of either Hirsch or someone associated with the show's archives. People sometimes claim the statue was destroyed at the end of the hunt. It was not. It still exists, although its current location is not always publicly known. The statue's continuing existence is, in a small way, a confirmation that the show's mythology has not fully ended, that the physical artifacts that mattered are still around, that the world the show built is still partially accessible. The fact that the statue continues to exist also creates a small, uncanny resonance with the final shot of the show. There is a Bill Cipher statue in the world, and there is a Bill Cipher statue in the woods of Gravity Falls, and the boundary between the fictional and the real is, in this small way, blurred. The Lost Legends graphic novel, published in 2018, is another piece of expanded universe content that fans sometimes treat as continuous with the show. Lost Legends is a collection of 4 short comics, each set during the events of the original series, and each filling in events that the show alluded to but did not depict. The stories include a small piece set during the events between certain episodes, a piece focused on Pacifica Northwest, a piece focused on Seuss, and a piece focused on a previously unseen adventure of the Pines family. People sometimes treat the events depicted in Lost Legends as canon, and sometimes as separate continuity. Hirsch has confirmed the content as canon, although the stories are not strictly necessary for understanding the show. They function more as additional flavor, as filling in around the edges of a story that the show already completed. People sometimes remember Lost Legends as having more content than it does. It is 4 short pieces, totaling perhaps 150 pages, and most of it is contained within events the show already gestured toward. The Star vs. the Forces of Evil crossover, which took the form of a brief animated short, is another piece of supplementary content that fans sometimes overstate. Star vs. the Forces of Evil was another Disney animated series, also created by a young creator with a strong personal vision, and the 2 shows had thematic overlap as well as overlapping fan communities. Hirsch participated in a small crossover piece, of which the most discussed element is a sequence implying that the 2 shows might share a universe or at least be aware of each other. People sometimes remember this crossover as more elaborate than it was. It was a small sequence. The Gravity Falls cosmology has not been officially merged with Star vs. the Forces of Evil. The implication exists. The implication has not been confirmed at length. The Rick and Morty crossover, which fans frequently bring up, is another piece of cross-media content that has been variously misremembered. Bill Cipher's voice actor Alex Hirsch and Rick Sanchez's voice actor Justin Roiland are friends, and the 2 shows have referenced each other multiple times. Rick and Morty has included Easter egg references to Gravity Falls in its episodes. Gravity Falls has included references to Rick and Morty. There have been short crossover comic sequences and promotional materials. People sometimes assume there is a full crossover episode. There is not. The crossover exists at the level of mutual reference, not at the level of integrated storytelling. The implication that the 2 universes are connected is allowed to remain implication. People sometimes inflate this to a degree the actual material does not support. The musical score of Gravity Falls is composed by Brad Breek, whose work on the show has become one of the more underappreciated elements of the production. The main theme, the brief instrumental piece that plays under the opening sequence, is built around a repeating motif that the score then varies throughout the series. The motif is recognizable, melancholy, and surprisingly adult for a children's animation, and Breek's variations on it become part of how the show signals emotional weight in particular scenes. People sometimes remember specific musical cues from the show as being more elaborate than they actually are, particularly the music in the more dramatic scenes of the second season, which is often relatively simple but emotionally precise. The score's restraint is part of what makes the show feel like it is taking its own emotional content seriously, rather than overselling it. The age of the twins is a piece of show canon that fans sometimes get confused on. Dipper and Mabel are 12 years old throughout the show, on the cusp of turning 13, and they actually turn 13 during the events of one of the second season episodes. The episode that takes place around their birthday is sometimes misremembered as occurring earlier or later in the season than it does. The transition from 12 to 13 is one of the show's quiet pieces of structural symbolism, because the twins enter the show as children and leave the show as teenagers, and the precise moment of that transition is marked by a birthday party that occurs during the second season, after which the show subtly shifts its treatment of them. People sometimes remember the twins as older or younger than they are. They are 12, then 13, then leave town at the end of the summer of their 13th year. The compression of their growth into a single summer is part of the show's emotional engine. Wendy is 15 when the show begins, 3 years older than Dipper, a gap that the show treats with care. Dipper's crush on Wendy is a function of his being 12 and her being 15, and the show is careful to depict the impossibility of the relationship without making either character look bad for the impossibility. Wendy is kind to Dipper. Dipper learns, slowly, over the run of the show, that his feelings are real, but not actionable, that the difference in age and life stage matters, and that friendship is the appropriate shape for what they share. The resolution of the crush plotline, when it comes in the second season, is handled with a maturity that has gained the show significant respect from people who have rewatched it as adults. People sometimes misremember how the crush ends. It ends in a private conversation where Dipper and Wendy talk honestly about it and decide together what they want their relationship to be, which is a more grown-up resolution than most television gives to such things. Seuss is, by Hirsch's account, in his early to mid-20s throughout the show, although the show is deliberately vague about his exact age. He is significantly older than the twins, significantly younger than Stan, and the show treats him as an emotional bridge between the two generations. Seuss's arc is one of moving from being a perpetual child in adult form to becoming someone capable of taking on adult responsibility, and the eventual inheritance of the Mystery Shack is the culmination of that arc. People sometimes remember Seuss as being closer in age to the twins than he is. He is an adult, with adult responsibilities, who has chosen to remain in an environment that allows him to be playful, and the difference between him and the twins is part of what makes the relationships work. The Pines family lineage, as gradually revealed across the show and in supplementary material, is one of the more carefully worked out pieces of show genealogy. Dipper and Mabel are the children of Mr. and Mrs. Pines, who are briefly glimpsed in a small number of episodes, and who are not named on screen. Their parents are the children of Shermy Pines, who is the brother of Stan and Ford, and who is therefore the twins' grandfather, making Stan and Ford the twins' great-uncles. The relationship is one generation removed from what people sometimes assume. Stan and Ford are great-uncles, not uncles. The Grunkle and Grunkle Stan is a contraction of great-uncle. Some fans sometimes remember Stan and Ford as the twins' actual uncles rather than their great-uncles. The distinction matters because it explains the age gap between Stan and the twins, and because it places the generational structure of the family more clearly. Shermy himself is a barely seen character in the show, although Hirsch has confirmed his existence in interviews and in supplementary material, and a small piece of further family history has been worked out in the Book of Bill and other expansions. The Pines family before Stan and Ford is also sketched in the second season, particularly in the Tale of Two Stans flashback episode. The brothers' parents are seen in flashbacks. Their father is a stern, disappointed man who runs a small business, who values success, and is harsh to children who fail him. Their mother is a fortune teller who runs her own small business reading palms and giving psychic advice over the telephone, although her actual psychic abilities are implied to be limited. People sometimes remember the parents as appearing in more episodes than they do. They appear primarily in the flashback episode and only briefly in supplementary material. Their depiction is enough to establish where the brothers came from, both literally and emotionally, and the show does not need more of them than that. The father's cruelty towards Stan after the school project incident is one of the formative wounds that the show traces, and his absence from the present-day timeline is the show's way of leaving him in the past where he belongs. The Mystery Shack itself, as a building, has a small set of physical details that fans sometimes misremember. The building has an attic where the twins sleep, a main floor where the tourist trap operates and Stan lives, and a basement that initially contains the gift shop's storage and eventually is revealed to contain the portal. The building is roughly the size of a single-family home, although the show's exterior shots sometimes make it look larger. There is a totem pole outside, a sign with the partially detachable S, a parking lot, a small porch, and the surrounding forest. The interior of the shack contains more eccentric details than the exterior would suggest, including various tourist trap exhibits Stan has constructed out of taxidermy, hardware, and confidence. People sometimes remember the Mystery Shack as appearing to be a more substantial building than it actually is. The show is consistent about the building's modest size, and the various tourist exhibits Stan has constructed are squeezed into what is, in fact, a relatively cramped space. That tightness is part of why the building feels lived in. The opening intro of every episode contains, in addition to its theme music and visual sequence, a brief title card that names the episode, and the typography and presentation of these title cards is consistent across the series. People sometimes remember the title cards as varying more than they actually do. There is a single visual format that is used across nearly all episodes, with very minor variations. The few episodes that deviate from this format do so deliberately and meaningfully, signaling that the episode in question is structurally unusual. People sometimes assume these deviations are more frequent than they are. They are exceptions, and identifying them is part of what makes rewatching the show rewarding. The famous frame of Bill Cipher in the opening sequence, the single subliminal flash that you can only see if you pause the video, has its own piece of trivia attached to it. The frame appears for only a few frames at a particular point in the intro, and you can only consciously perceive it if you slow the video down or pause at the right moment. The frame is intentional. It has been there since the first episode of the series. People sometimes remember the frame as being added later, as having appeared first in a specific second season episode. It has been there from the start. The implication that Bill has been embedded in the show from its first moments, even before the audience knew Bill existed, is one of the show's quietly perfect pieces of design. The villain is in the credits of the very first episode, and you simply did not see him because you did not know how to look. The very first cipher in the very first episode, decoded by the very first wave of fans during the first broadcast run, contained a brief message that confirmed the show was going to be using ciphers throughout its run and that the audience should pay attention. The message was simple, almost a greeting, almost a wink, and it began the practice of the show speaking to its audience through encrypted text that would continue for 2 full seasons and end with the bittersweet farewell of the final episode. People sometimes remember the early ciphers as being more elaborate than they were. The first ciphers were simple Caesar shifts, intentionally easy to crack, so that fans would be drawn into the practice of decoding. As the show progressed, the ciphers became more difficult, requiring the @bash cipher, then the A1Z26 numbering, then the Vigenère, which required keys that had to be derived from the episodes themselves. The progression of cipher difficulty across the series is one of the show's quiet pieces of audience engineering, a way of slowly teaching the viewer to look harder at what is in front of them. The number 8, which recurs throughout the show in various subtle ways, has occasionally been theorized by fans to have hidden significance. People will point to the number appearing in certain episodes, on certain objects, in certain pieces of dialogue, and suggest a hidden pattern. Hirsch has, in interviews, sometimes acknowledged that the number has a small personal significance to him and sometimes deflected the question. The interpretation that the number is a piece of intentional running symbolism is one fans have largely settled on, although the show itself does not commit to any particular meaning. The implication is that the show is full of small details whose meanings are partly intentional and partly accreted by audience interpretation, and the distinction between the two can be blurry. The triangle and circle imagery, particularly the way certain shots compose triangles and circles in their visual structure, has been cataloged by fans extensively. The argument is that the show uses triangular composition for scenes associated with Bill and the more sinister elements of the universe, and circular composition for scenes associated with the Pines family and the more harmonious elements. The argument is partly supported by the show's actual visual design and partly imposed by fan interpretation. People sometimes treat this kind of compositional analysis as authoritative. It is more accurately understood as a productive reading, one of several possible readings, and the show is rich enough to support several at once. The animation studio that produced Gravity Falls, Rough Draft Studios, also worked on a number of other significant animated shows during the same period, and the visual style of Gravity Falls bears some recognizable characteristics of the studio's broader output. The animation is unusually detailed for a Disney Channel production of its era, particularly in the rendering of the forest backgrounds and the various creatures that populate the town. The studio's commitment to background detail is part of what makes the show as rewatchable as it is. There are visual jokes in nearly every shot, characters in the background doing things that have nothing to do with the foreground action, posters and signs and graffiti that contain small messages, and the cumulative effect is of a town that is alive in ways the foreground plot has no time to depict. People sometimes assume this density is the work of the writers alone. It is a collaboration between writing and animation, and the studio deserves much of the credit for the show feeling as full as it does. The release of the show in syndication on Disney Plus after the streaming service launched gave the series a kind of second life that has been important to its ongoing fan community. Children who watched the show on its original broadcast in the early 2010s have become adults who can now show it to their own younger siblings, or rewatch it as a comfort piece, and the show has gained new viewers continuously since its release on streaming. People sometimes assume the show has had a more conventional afterlife than this. It has actually had an unusually active one, with the Book of Bill release in 2024 generating significant attention and bringing a new generation of fans into the universe. The show is one of the few mid-2010s animated series whose cultural footprint has continued to grow rather than recede in the years since its conclusion. The Land Before Swine episode is one that fans sometimes remember as more harrowing than it actually is. The premise is that Mabel's beloved pig Waddles is kidnapped by a living pterodactyl, prompting Stan to lead a rescue mission into a hidden subterranean ecosystem beneath the town where prehistoric creatures still exist. The episode is a quiet portrait of Stan's growing affection for the twins and for Waddles, demonstrating that Stan, who initially treated the pig as a nuisance, has come to love it as part of the family. The rescue is successful. Waddles is returned to Mabel. The pterodactyl is left in its underground habitat, alive and presumably going on to whatever pterodactyl life it had before. People sometimes remember the episode as having a darker resolution. It does not. The show is gentle with the pterodactyl, treating it as a creature with its own ecology rather than a villain, and Stan's affection for the pig becomes one of the small running heart moments of the rest of the series. The Society of the Blind Eye, which I touched on earlier, has a specific membership roster that fans sometimes get wrong. The members shown in the show include Ivan, the apparent leader at the time of the children's investigation, plus several other townspeople, including the local journalist Toby Determined, and a few others. McGucket, the original founder, is no longer an active member at the time the society is encountered, having long since gone into hiding after his mind degraded to the point where he could not maintain the leadership role. People sometimes remember the society as having more members than the show actually depicts. The depicted group is small, perhaps half a dozen, although the implication is that the society has had many more members across the years it has existed. Toby Determined's presence in the society is one of the show's small Easter eggs, because Toby is the most recognizably foolish of the townspeople, and his presence in a secret society inverts what the audience expects. The implication, on rewatch, is that anyone in the town might be in the society, that the secret society is hidden in plain sight, and that the people the audience dismisses as background characters often have hidden lives. Toby Determined himself, the local newspaper publisher, is a character whose desperate loneliness is sketched across multiple episodes. He runs the town's small newspaper, the Gravity Falls Gossiper, almost single-handed, and he has a hopeless crush on the news anchor Chandra Jimenez, who treats him with polite dismissal. His attempts to impress her are uniformly pathetic, and the show plays them for a particular kind of melancholy comedy. People sometimes remember Toby as a more central character than he is. He is recurring, but his actual screen time is limited. His presence in the show is enough to give the town the feel of having a working media ecosystem, however small and tragic. Tate McGucket, the son of Old Man McGucket, is a character introduced in the Gobblewonker episode, where he runs a small lakeside business and refuses to speak to his father. The estrangement is presented as long-standing, with Tate apparently having given up on his father years earlier, after McGucket's mental decline made any normal relationship impossible. The episode ends without their relationship being repaired, although the show implies in later moments that some kind of partial reconnection has happened. By the time of the finale, with McGucket having recovered most of his mental faculties, the implication is that the father and son have begun to rebuild their relationship, although the show does not depict this directly. People sometimes remember Tate as appearing in more episodes than he does. He is essentially a one-episode character with a few subsequent cameos, but his existence is enough to establish that McGucket has a family who has suffered alongside him, and that the cost of McGucket's research extended beyond his own mind. The first pilot of the show, the one Hirsch produced before the series was greenlit, is a piece of behind-the-scenes content that fans sometimes remember as having different characters than the show eventually used. The original pilot, which has been shown at conventions and is available in various forms, contains earlier versions of Dipper and Mabel, with slightly different designs, plus rough versions of Stan and the Mystery Shack. The pilot is recognizable as the show, but the specific tone and the specific characters are noticeably rougher. People sometimes treat the pilot as canon. It is not. It is a pitch document that became the show, but the show as broadcast is the canon version, and the pilot's differences are best understood as the artifacts of a work in progress. The marketing materials Disney produced for the show, particularly during the second season's promotion of the author mystery, included a number of small pieces of supplementary content that fans sometimes incorporate into their memory of the show itself. There were puzzle pieces released on the Disney website, codes embedded in promotional shorts, social media posts that were themselves ciphers. People sometimes remember the show as containing content that actually appeared only in these promotional materials. The distinction matters because the show itself is a self-contained text, while the promotional materials are a kind of expanded ecosystem around it, and conflating the two can lead to claims about the show that the show itself does not support. The episode order, the specific sequence in which the episodes were broadcast, and the sequence in which they appear on streaming services, has small variations that fans sometimes notice and sometimes do not. The production order is not always the broadcast order, and the broadcast order is not always the order in which the episodes appear on Disney+. People sometimes remember episodes as occurring in a different position in the run than they actually do, partly because of this. The placement of certain self-contained episodes in particular is somewhat flexible across different presentations, while the major plot-driven episodes have a fixed position that the show itself reinforces through dialogue and continuity. The voice direction on the show, supervised by Hirsch personally, has been credited by the cast as one of the reasons the performances feel as natural as they do. Hirsch reportedly directed the actors collaboratively, allowing improvisation, asking for multiple takes with different emotional weights, and trusting the actors to find the rhythms of their characters. The cast has spoken in interviews about the freedom they were given to shape their performances, and the show's casual conversational quality is in part a result of that approach. People sometimes assume that animation voice work is mechanical, that the actors deliver lines on cue and the result is assembled in post. The truth on Gravity Falls is closer to a theatrical rehearsal process, where the performances developed organically across multiple sessions. That investment is part of what gives the show its emotional density. The decision to depict Stan's con artist past with as little romanticization as the show does is one of the more careful pieces of moral writing in the series. Stan is, by his own account and by the show's depiction, a man who has done bad things, who has hurt people, who has not always been kind, and who is not magically redeemed by his love for the twins. The show consistently acknowledges this. Even in scenes where Stan's affection is shown most clearly, the show is willing to remind the audience that this is a man who lies for a living, who has multiple aliases, who has been to prison in several states. The interpretation, what the show implies in this carefulness, is that love does not erase history, that being a good great uncle does not undo the harm one has caused, and that the work of being a better person is ongoing rather than achieved. Stan, at the end of the show, is still recognizably Stan. He has not been transformed into a saint. He has simply earned the right to be loved by the people who know him, which is a much smaller and more honest accomplishment. The way the show treats Ford's character arc is similarly careful. Ford is a brilliant scientist who was manipulated by a being who flattered him, and the show acknowledges that the manipulation worked in part because Ford was vulnerable to it. His 30 years in the portal have made him both wiser and more damaged, and the show depicts both qualities without resolving them too neatly. Ford reconciles with Stan, sort of. Ford repairs his relationship with McGucket, sort of. Ford recognizes the cost of his choices, sort of. The show is honest that some wounds heal incompletely, that some relationships can be partially repaired but not fully restored, and that the work of accepting these limits is part of growing up even for adults. Ford in the finale is wiser than Ford at the start of the second season, but he is still recognizably the same man, with the same vulnerabilities and the same regrets. The way the show depicts the twins' relationship across the run is one of the central achievements of the writing. Dipper and Mabel begin the show as inseparable, almost a single unit, finishing each other's sentences and operating with a shared confidence that comes from having always had each other. The second season slowly introduces fissures between them. They disagree more often. They want different things. Dipper considers staying in Gravity Falls. Mabel resists growing up. The bubble episode is the climactic expression of this tension, and the finale's resolution is not a return to the original unity, but rather a new kind of relationship, one in which the twins remain devoted to each other while also acknowledging that they are becoming different people. People sometimes remember the finale as restoring the original closeness. It does not, exactly. The closeness is preserved, but it has been transformed. The twins are still twins. They are also each starting to become themselves, separately, in ways that the original unity could not have contained. The show treats this as a quiet, melancholy gift, and the audience often remembers it as either more or less melancholic than it actually is. The final scene of the children in the show, before the post-credits stone statue, is the bus pulling away from Gravity Falls. The twins are inside the bus. The townspeople are on the platform. Stan and Ford are standing together, and the bus begins its long drive back to the world the twins came from. The show plays this moment with restraint. There is no soaring music. There is no triumphant dialogue. The twins simply look back through the window, then forward, then settle into their seats, and the bus pulls away. The implication, gently planted, is that they will be back, perhaps next summer, perhaps in some other form, perhaps in their memories, and in the lives they continue to live. The implication is also that they might not be back, that some summers do not repeat, that the experience of Gravity Falls might exist for them as a single contained chapter that they will carry the rest of their lives. The show offers both possibilities and chooses neither. The audience is left with the bus, the dust on the road, and the silence. The post-credits stone statue, which I have circled back to several times across this video, is the show's final image and the source of the most enduring conversation about its actual ending. The image is of Bill Cipher, in his stone form, in the woods, with one hand outstretched, in a position that suggests he is waiting to be shaken. The show offers no explanation of how to interpret this. There is no voiceover. There is no following scene. The screen cuts to black, and the show is over. The interpretation people have settled on, over the years, is that the image is a warning, a suggestion that Bill is not entirely defeated, that he might return if anyone foolish enough completes the gesture he is making. The Book of Bill, published years later, has expanded on this implication considerably, suggesting that Bill has indeed survived in some form, that the Theraprism is his current location, and that he might one day return through a sequence of events that the supplementary material has begun to outline. People sometimes treat the post-credits image as definitive proof of a sequel coming. It is not exactly that. It is a deliberately open door, a possibility, a suggestion that the universe is not closed even though the show is over. The way the show handles the question of childhood ending, which is its deepest thematic concern, is one of the things that has made it endure. The show does not pretend that growing up is uncomplicated. It does not pretend that the loss of the summer is somehow worth what you gain. It does not pretend that adulthood is a destination you arrive at with certainty. The show simply depicts the moment of leaving, the moment of the bus pulling away, the moment of the parents waiting in the driveway when the twins get home, and trusts the audience to feel the weight of what has happened. The audience is asked to recognize that they are also leaving Gravity Falls, in the sense that the show is ending, and that this kind of leaving is what life keeps asking us to do, again and again, across all the years we are alive. We leave summers, we leave childhoods, we leave the small worlds that contained us when we needed containment. We leave them not because we want to, but because we cannot stay. And the leaving is, in some sense, the price of having been there at all. The Mandela effects that have grown up around the show are themselves a function of how much the show meant to people who watched it. We misremember the things that mattered most. We compress and expand and rearrange the moments that made us feel something. And the show's particular shape, full of small details and large feelings, is the kind of shape that the human memory finds especially easy to distort. The show was always going to be misremembered in particular ways, because the show was always going to be loved in particular ways. And the things we love, we change in our heads, the way a river changes a stone. The Bill statue in the woods is partly there to remind us of this. Some things look the same after you have been away from them for a long time. Some things do not. The shape you remember is not always the shape that is still there. The act of going back is, every time, a small reckoning with how memory works. The show's afterlife, in the form of the Book of Bill and the Lost Legends and the various pieces of supplementary material, is also part of how this reckoning continues. New material arrives. Old material is revisited. Things that fans had decoded a decade ago are recontextualized by new information. The universe is not static. It continues to develop in small bursts as Hirsch decides to add to it. People sometimes treat this ongoing expansion as either a betrayal of the original show or a triumphant continuation of it. It is both and neither. The original show is complete. The expansions add to it. The expansions are also their own things, and they do not always sit perfectly alongside the show they are expanding. The audience is permitted to engage with whichever version of the universe feels right to them. There is no wrong way to be a Gravity Falls fan. The town of Gravity Falls, in the show's imagination, continues to exist after the children leave. The supernatural creatures continue to inhabit its forests. The townspeople continue to live their small, strange lives. Seuss runs the Mystery Shack. McGucket investigates the world from his newly inherited mansion. The federal agents have forgotten everything. The Northwests have lost their fortune. The Bill statue sits in the woods, gradually being colonized by moss, waiting for a hand that may or may not come. The world the show built continues, even as the camera no longer follows it, and the audience is invited to imagine what it is doing now, in whatever version of the present we are in. That continuation, that sense of a place that exists outside the frame of our viewing, is one of the show's quiet generosities. The town does not depend on us watching to remain real. It is real on its own terms. The show simply allowed us to visit for a while. And now, as the video draws to its close, we should step back from all of these specific details, from the ciphers and the henchmaniacs and the missing journals and the misremembered intros, and consider what the show, taken as a whole, has actually given to the people who loved it. Gravity Falls is a show about a small American town, about two children who spent a summer there, about the secret history of the people who lived in that town, and about the way that any place, if you look at it closely enough, contains more than you could ever fully see. It is also a show about siblings, about the difficulty of growing up alongside someone you love, about the way the people closest to you change at different rates than you do, and about the work of staying connected to each other across those changes. It is also a show about old men who failed each other and who are trying, in their final years, to figure out whether that failure can be partially mended. It is also a show about how the things that look ordinary often are not, and the things that look strange often are exactly what they appear to be. It holds all of these threads at once, across 40 episodes, and weaves them into something that feels much larger than its component parts. The fact that the show's ending leaves a stone statue of its villain in the woods, waiting, is the show's way of saying that no ending is final. The fact that the show's beginning is a backwards whisper in the credits, planted there from the first moment of the first episode, is the show's way of saying that no beginning is innocent. The show is, in its bones, an argument that meaning is everywhere, that nothing is accidental, that every detail in your peripheral vision might matter in ways you will only understand later. That argument is what gives the show its particular flavor, and it is also what gives the show its particular afterlife. People keep coming back to Gravity Falls because Gravity Falls keeps giving back. The ciphers continue to yield new readings. The background frames continue to reward attention. The supplementary material continues to add layers. The fan community continues to decode, theorize, and reinterpret. The show was designed to be returned to, and it is being returned to, and it will continue to be returned to for as long as anyone is willing to look. If you grew up with Gravity Falls, the show is part of the architecture of your imagination, the way certain stories become part of the furniture of who you are. If you came to it later, The show is one of those rare things that survives the lowered expectations of adult viewing. The kind of thing you can show to other adults without apologizing for it being a children's animation. If you are returning to it now, in this strange decade after its ending, you will find that it has gained rather than lost in the time you have been away from it. The Bill statue is still in the woods, both literally in the world Hirsch placed it in and metaphorically in the show's fiction. The town is still there. The summer is still ending. The bus is still pulling away. The brothers are still sailing. The journals are still hidden. The triangles are still embedded in the backgrounds. The ciphers are still waiting to be decoded by someone with patience and a quiet evening. The show is still, in its strange, persistent way, ongoing, even though it is technically over. So thank you for spending this time with us. Thank you for sitting through every detail, every misremembered fact, every clarified piece of canon, every careful distinction between what the show told you and what your memory filled in afterward. Gravity Falls is one of the small, mid-era animation shows that turned out to matter much